The kitchen is still dark when you open your eyes. Not the darkness of the middle of the night, but the softer, greyer kind that comes just before the world decides to wake. It settles against the windows like something gentle. The curtains, cotton, faded from too many washings, hold the shape of a breeze that passed through hours ago and has since gone quiet. You're in a kitchen in 1940s America. You know this not from anything dramatic, but from the small and specific details all around you. The icebox stands against the far wall, its white enamel yellowed along the edges, humming with that low, reliable sound it makes on warm mornings. The radio on the counter is dark and silent for now. The calendar above the sink shows a month in a year when the world was moving through something enormous, and people were doing what they always do in the middle of enormous things. They were living, they were making coffee, they were getting up before anyone else asked them to. There is a smell in this kitchen that is hard to name exactly. It is coffee, yes, from yesterday's grounds still sitting in the percolator. It is soap, the kind that comes in a bar, ivory pale, sitting in its dish beside the sink. It is something underneath both of those things, something that belongs to the house itself, wood and warmth, and the particular weight of a place that has held many mornings, that knows how to hold this one too. A clock ticks somewhere nearby. You can hear it without looking for it. It is not an urgent sound. It is the sound of time passing in the only way it knows how, steadily, without drama, 1 second following the one before. Somewhere in another room, someone is sleeping still. You can feel the particular quiet of a house where sleeping is happening. It is different from an empty house, warmer, more complete. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. You settle into this morning. You let it come to you slowly. There is no hurry here. The day will begin when it begins. For now, the kitchen holds the darkness, and the quiet, and the smell of coffee and soap. For now, this is enough. This is everything. This is a story about women who lived inside ordinary mornings like this one. Women who built worlds out of small things, who carried more than anyone thought to measure, who found a kind of knowledge in the repetition of days that no school ever taught and no book ever fully captured. They are not famous, most of them left no record, but they were here, in kitchens like this one, in houses like this one, in mornings exactly like this one, and if you listen quietly enough, you can almost hear them still. You begin in the kitchen, but the kitchen is only one room of many, and each room has its own character, its own smell, its own particular quality of light at different hours of the day. A house in the 1940s was not simply a structure of walls and roof and floor. It was a living system, and the woman of the house was the person who understood it most completely, not in the way an architect understands a building, but in the way a gardener understands a garden, through years of attention, through knowing which floorboard squeaks, which window sticks in summer, which corner of the parlour turns cold when the wind comes from the north. Let yourself move through this house slowly. There is no reason to hurry. The kitchen floor is linoleum, a pattern of cream and rust that has been mopped so many times the pattern has softened at the centre of the room, just in front of the stove, where the traffic is heaviest. It is cool under bare feet in the morning, cool enough to wake you gently, and then the rug, a braided oval in browns and greens made from strips of old coats and dresses, accepts your weight with a softness that is almost a kindness. The rug was made by hand. You can feel the individual ridges of the braiding through your soles. Someone's hands worked those strips of cloth together on winter evenings, when there was nothing else to be done and the fire needed minding. The stove is cast iron, black, enormous in the way that things built to last are enormous. It stands against the wall like something that has always been there and always will be. In winter, it heats the whole kitchen, and the room above it, and sometimes the hallway outside the door, all without being asked. You feed it wood in the morning, kindling first, then the heavier pieces, and in return it gives you heat and a surface for the pots and the frying pan and the percolator that makes its particular spitting, gurgling sound when the coffee is ready. The stove does not merely cook food, it is the centre of the house's warmth in every sense of that word. The sink is deep, porcelain, with a single tap for cold water. Hot water is heated on the stove or in the boiler in the basement, carried in pots or drawn from the tap, only if the boiler has been attended to, which it must be, daily, with a specific series of steps that are so familiar they happen without thought. There is a wooden draining board beside the sink, worn smooth from years of wet dishes and wet hands. The grain of the wood has opened slightly along one edge, where it meets the sink, and it must be dried carefully, or the moisture works its way under the board and the wood darkens. You know this. You have known it for years. The drying is part of the washing. Above the sink, a window. This is the most important window in the house, more important than the parlour window or the bedroom window, or even the window on the landing that lets in the afternoon light. The window above the sink faces the backyard, and from it you can see, depending on the season of the garden, the clothesline, the elm tree that turns gold in October, the vegetable patch in summer, the snow that covers everything in February and makes the world simple and still and briefly manageable. You spend more hours looking through this window than through any other. You wash dishes and watch the yard. You peel vegetables and watch the yard. You're almost always doing two things at once. The pantry is off the kitchen, a narrow room that smells of flour and dried herbs and the cool earthiness of root vegetables stored in bushel baskets on the lower shelf. The shelves are painted white, slightly yellowing now, and they hold the glass jars that represent an entire summer's work: green beans, tomatoes, beets, applesauce, peach preserves, pickles, the small intense jewels of cherry jam. The jars are arranged in neat rows, labelled in pencil on strips of paper towel pressed to the lids. The labels say what is inside and when it was put up. In a house where nothing is wasted, the pantry is the archive of the year's abundance, held in reserve against the months when nothing grows. The parlour is kept tidy. Not cold, it is a room that is used, that holds the family's evenings, but tidy in a way that is different from the kitchen's kind of order. The kitchen's order is functional, things where they need to be so that work can proceed. The parlour's order is something else, a kind of presentation, an arrangement that says something about who lives here and how they want to be seen. The sofa is covered with a slipcover in a faded floral, positioned facing the radio, which sits in a cabinet in the corner. There is a lamp with a fringed shade. There is a photograph on the mantel in an oval frame. There is a braided rug, larger than the one in the kitchen, slightly more formal in its pattern. The bedrooms are upstairs. You know the stairs by feel, know which step requires a little more pressure, and which gives slightly underfoot. The children's room smells of sleep and warmth, and something sweetly indefinable that belongs specifically to children, a smell that is not unclean but simply biological, the smell of small bodies that have been here all night. You check on them without waking them. You stand in the doorway for a moment, which is all you allow yourself, and then you pull the door back to its original position, the exact angle that will not squeak, and you return to the stairs. Your own bedroom holds the bed with its white chenille spread, the dresser with its oval mirror, the small table beside the bed where a glass of water sits, and a book has been lying face down for 2 weeks, because there is never quite enough time. The room is yours, but it is also the room you share, and in the mornings it holds the shape of the night just past, the indentation in the pillow, the smell of sleep, the particular intimacy of a space where only the most private things happen. The basement is functional. Concrete floor, bare bulb, the boiler along one wall, the laundry tubs along the other, wooden shelving along the back wall for the things that do not belong to any other room, extra canning jars, the Christmas decorations in a cardboard box, the tools your husband uses on weekends, old paint cans, a broken chair waiting to be mended. The basement smells of damp and metal and the particular mineral cold of concrete in winter. It is not a pleasant room, but it is a necessary one, and you treat it with the same practical respect you give everything in this house. The house has a rhythm, and you are the person who knows it best. You know what happens at what hour, what must be done before what can wait, and what cannot. The rhythm is not written down anywhere. It does not need to be. It is in your body, in the way you move through these rooms, in the order of the steps you take each morning when the kitchen is still grey, and the family are still sleeping, and the day is still, for one more quiet moment, entirely yours. You move through all of it with a sureness that comes not from confidence exactly, but from knowledge, from the accumulated knowing of years of days exactly like this one. The house is yours in that way, not in the legal sense, not in the sense of a name on a deed, but in the sense of deep familiarity, of understanding so complete that the house seems almost to recognise you in return. The stove draws better when you tend it. The bread rises well in your kitchen. The rooms hold their warmth. There are cracks in the plaster above the parlour doorway that have been there since before you came. There is a place on the second step where the riser has pulled slightly away from the tread, and you have asked twice for it to be fixed. There is a window in the dining room that rattles when the wind comes from the west. None of these things are fixed quickly. They become part of the texture of the house, part of what you know, part of what you work around, with the patient ingenuity of someone who has learned that waiting is not the same as accepting. In winter, the house demands more. The drafts find the spaces between the window frames and the walls, and you seal them with rolled newspapers and strips of old sheeting. You hang heavy drapes. You close the doors to rooms that are not being used, concentrating the heat in the rooms where the family lives. The house becomes smaller in winter, more contained, pulled inward against the cold. You learn to love this smallness, the way it brings the family together by necessity into the warm rooms, the way the kitchen and the parlour become the whole world on the coldest days. In summer, the house breathes differently. The windows open in the morning to let the cooler air move through, and you close them before noon when the heat comes. And the house holds the morning coolness like a jar holds something cold, releasing it slowly through the long afternoon. There is a porch at the back, screened, where the evening is spent when the days are long and warm, where the children play after supper and the mosquitoes come and the jar lids ring against the porch railing where they've been set to cool. Through all of it, winter and summer, morning and night, the ordinary days and the days that feel like more, the house holds you, and you hold the house. It is a mutual arrangement, unspoken and complete, the kind of relationship that is built not in a moment but in 1,000 moments, each one small, each one ordinary, each one adding to the weight of a life lived inside these particular walls. The clock still ticks, the house still breathes. Outside, the sky has shifted from grey to the softest possible pink, the colour of the inside of a shell, the colour of a morning that is almost but not quite here. You are in the kitchen again, as you always return to the kitchen, and the stove is warm and the percolator is beginning its work and the house is waking slowly around you, room by room, step by step, the way it always does. Let yourself rest here for a moment, in this house, in this morning, in the particular quiet before the day begins. There is nothing to do yet. There is only this. The house has a front and a back, and the two halves inhabit different relationships to the world. The front is presentational. It faces the street, holds the parlour and the formal dining room, manages the impression the house makes on anyone approaching. The back is functional. It holds the kitchen and the garden and the clothesline and the general equipment of daily life that has no business being visible from the street. This division is so naturalised that it rarely requires thought. The front is for seeing, the back is for living. There is a linen closet on the upstairs landing, a deep narrow closet smelling of cedar from the blocks placed there to discourage the moths. The shelves hold the household's bedding in a particular order, the good sheets on top reserved for company and special occasions, pressed and folded with their creases aligned. The everyday sheets below them, also pressed, also folded, in the rotation that cycles them through the wash and back to the shelf, so that no single set bears all the use. The extra blankets on the bottom shelf, dense and heavy, wool pulled out in the coldest weeks of January and February, when the house, despite the stove, requires more. The bathroom is small, a tub and a sink and the medicine cabinet with its mirror, the towel bar on the wall beside the tub holding the towels in their colour-coded order, the children's towels and the adults' towels, each hanging where it belongs. The medicine cabinet holds the small pharmacopoeia of the household, the aspirin, the iodine, the adhesive bandages, the thermometer in its case, the cream for dry hands, the cough syrup, the particular remedies for the particular ailments that the household has learned to manage over time. Everything has its place. The medicine cabinet is perhaps the most precisely organised space in the house. The attic is not a room in the inhabited sense, but it is a room in the house's sense, and it holds the overflow of the household's life. The things that are not needed now, but that will be needed eventually, or that might be needed, or that represent a connection to the past that cannot be simply discarded. The Christmas decorations in their boxes, the children's outgrown clothing folded and put in trunks against the possibility of another child, or the practical need for fabric. Old furniture, waiting for repair or for the moment when the household has space for it. The trunks from before the move. The objects whose value is sentimental rather than practical. In winter the attic is bitterly cold and in summer it is intolerable, And so your visits are brief and purposeful. You go for the Christmas decorations and come down. You go for the specific item in the specific trunk and come down. The attic is not somewhere you spend time, but you know it the way you know the rest of the house, by memory and by familiarity, by the knowledge of what is where and what might be needed and how long it has been since you have looked at what is there. The house holds the family in its particular configuration. It is sized for the family that lives in it, no larger and no smaller, which means it has the particular compressed intimacy of a house that is always full. There are no unused rooms here, no guest rooms waiting for guests who rarely come. Every room has its purpose and its occupants and its daily life, and the density of it, 4 people and their belongings and their habits and their relationships moving through these rooms every day, produces a texture of life that is full in a way that larger houses, with their unused corridors and their empty bedrooms, do not produce. The house is a specific fit for the life inside it. The life fits the house. The alarm does not wake you. You wake before it, as you almost always do, in the grey quiet of the hour before the household stirs, in that suspended moment between sleep and not sleep, when the mind is still unhurried and the body has not yet remembered everything it must carry today. You lie still for a moment, 1 breath, 2. The ceiling above you is familiar in its cracks and its shadows. You have looked at it so many times that you know it the way you know a face, know where the shadow falls along the plaster rose at the centre, know the faint line that runs from the east wall toward the window, a crack so old and stable it has become part of the room's character rather than a flaw to be repaired. Then you rise, quietly, with the particular care of someone who has learned to move through a sleeping house. You sit first, and the springs of the mattress make no sound, because you know exactly how to shift your weight. You find your slippers in the dark by memory. Your housecoat is on the hook behind the door, and you take it and close the door behind you with that specific gentle pressure, the handle turned before you pull so the latch does not click. The hallway is cooler than the bedroom. The house breathes differently at night, the warmth concentrated in the rooms where people sleep, the common rooms cooling slowly until morning. Your feet find the stairs. You count them without counting. At the bottom, you turn left, and the kitchen receives you. This is your hour, not the only hour that is yours. The whole day is yours, in a sense, filled with the work that you do. But this one is different. In this hour, before anyone calls your name, before the children woke and need things, before the day begins its insistent demands, you exist here in the kitchen in a way that belongs entirely to yourself. There is a quality to the solitude of early mornings that is unlike any other solitude. It is not lonely. It is clean. The first thing is the stove. In summer, you light only the 1 burner you need for the percolator, but in the colder months you open the firebox and tend it first, adding the larger pieces of wood over the coals that have kept through the night, adjusting the damper with the small particular motion that long practice has made automatic. The fire responds. You can hear it breathing, that low sound of combustion settling into steadiness, and within minutes the warmth begins to spread across the surface of the stovetop, and you rest your hands near it for a moment before you fill the percolator at the sink. Coffee is not a luxury. Coffee is medicine. It is the first thing that makes the morning real, the thing that transitions you from the grey half-awareness of just risen to the clear-eyed wakefulness that the day requires. You measure it by feel now, 2 scoops from the tin canister with the red lid. The coffee grounds slightly oily between your fingers when you test them. The smell rising immediately, that smell which is somehow both the coffee itself and the promise of everything the morning will become. While the percolator works, you begin. In this quiet interval between the putting on of the coffee and its readiness, you do the things that go unwitnessed and unacknowledged, but without which the morning would not be possible. You check the temperature of the icebox by holding your hand inside briefly. You confirm that the milk bottle on the back step has been brought in. It must have been. You hear yourself remembering bringing it in last night. You see what bread remains from yesterday and whether it is enough for today or whether you must bake before noon. The planning of meals is a kind of ongoing arithmetic that never fully stops. It runs beneath everything else, a quiet calculation that weighs what is in the pantry against what the family needs, against what is available and affordable and possible, given the hours ahead. During the war years, this arithmetic has an added layer, the ration book, the points, the things that are simply not available regardless of what you might afford or wish for. You have made this arithmetic so natural that you barely notice it anymore. It happens the way breathing happens, without deliberate thought, a constant background adjustment. The children begin to wake somewhere around the time the second cup of coffee is poured. You hear them before you see them. A creak from the ceiling above, the sound of small feet on the floor, the particular thump that means someone has gotten out of bed with more enthusiasm than caution. Then voices, muffled by the floor, a negotiation of some kind, who goes first to the bathroom, whose socks are whose, and then the stairs, and then they are here. The morning has a script that is never written down but is nevertheless followed each day with only minor variation. Faces must be washed, hair must be brushed. Breakfast must be eaten sitting down, not standing, not while getting dressed, sitting down at the table with both hands visible and no books open beside the plate. Shoes must be located, which requires a small daily investigation. Lunches must be prepared, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, an apple, sometimes a cookie if there are cookies, all of it placed in the pail in the order that keeps things from being crushed. You move through all of this efficiently, with a calm that is not the absence of effort but the presence of practice. There are mornings that go otherwise, mornings when someone is sick, when something has been forgotten that cannot be forgotten, when the stove will not draw and the kitchen fills with smoke, when two children have decided that the morning is the correct moment to address some grievance that has been building since Tuesday. You manage those mornings too. But on the ordinary mornings, on the mornings that are most of your mornings, everything moves with that quiet competence. Your husband eats quickly and leaves. The children leave next, in a rush, in that particular energy of children who have suddenly realized they are almost late when they were not almost late 5 minutes ago. The door closes. The house shifts from full to quiet in the space of a few minutes, and you stand in the kitchen and listen to the quiet settle around you like something being put down gently. This is another kind of solitude, the solitude after, different from the solitude before. The morning after quiet holds the evidence of the morning's activity. Plates in the sink, crumbs on the table, a small sock left behind the chair, the particular disarray that means life has happened here and has now gone out into the world. You survey it without urgency. You know exactly what must be done and exactly how long it will take, and exactly in what order it will proceed. You begin with the table. The cloth comes off, shaken at the back door, the crumbs released into the morning air to be received by the sparrows that have learned to be nearby at this hour. The cloth goes into the hamper. The oilcloth underneath is wiped clean with the damp cloth kept for that purpose, hanging on its particular hook. The plates go into the soapy water in the sink. Washing dishes by hand is not, as some might think, a mindless task. It has its own particular satisfactions. The hot water, the soap, the sound of water against the basin. There is a sequence to it. Glasses first, while the water is cleanest, then the plates, then the cups, then the cutlery, then the pots. Each thing is washed, rinsed, set on the draining board in the order that makes the most of gravity and airflow, and the dish towel's capacity for absorbing moisture. You move through it with that quality of attention that is not anxious attention but settled attention, the mind gently occupied without being pressed. By the time the kitchen is clean, the morning has advanced. The light has shifted from grey to white to the particular gold of mid-morning, coming through the window above the sink and lying in rectangles across the linoleum. The house is quiet. The stove ticks as the metal expands in the warmth. The clock on the mantel in the parlour chimes the hour. The day is now fully itself, and so are you. The morning rituals are complete. What comes next is the longer work. The cooking, the mending, the washing, the 100 small attentions the house requires. And you turn to it without drama, without ceremony, with only the simple orientation of a person who knows what must be done and knows that she is the one who will do it. There is a particular strength in this. Not the strength that gets noticed or praised or remembered, but the kind that makes everything else possible. The strength of the woman who rises before the household, who tends the fire, who makes the coffee, who sets the morning in motion so that everyone else can begin. It is a strength built from habit and care and the daily choice, repeated until it is no longer a choice but a way of being. You carry it quietly, as you carry everything. There is a word in German, Morgenrot, for the particular red of the early morning sky, and while you do not know the German word, you know the thing it names, have known it since childhood, have seen it through every east-facing window of every house you have lived in. The early morning sky does something to colour that the rest of the day's light does not do. It intensifies without harshening, makes the red of a brick wall more deeply itself, makes the bare winter trees against the pale sky look more fully drawn, as if the morning light had spent the night practising the world and was now showing its best rendering of it. The coffee is ready when the particular gurgling has stopped and been replaced by the lower, steadier sound of the liquid simply circulating in the completed percolation. You pour the first cup into the thick white mug that belongs to morning, not the china cups used when there are visitors, not the everyday cups of the afternoon, but the thick white mug that is yours and is understood to be yours, that has no other purpose and no other user. The first sip of the morning's first cup of coffee is one of the day's small, reliable pleasures, a pleasure that requires no preparation beyond the preparation that has already been made. The kitchen in the hour before the family wakes has a quality that can only be experienced from inside it. You have tried to describe it to yourself, and the description is always inadequate, because the quality is primarily sensory, and sensory experience resists reduction to words. It is the combination of the warmth from the stove and the coolness from the window, and the smell of the coffee, and the particular quality of silence that is not absence of sound, but the sound of a house doing its own quiet work, the ticking of the metal, the murmur of the boiler, the sound of the wind outside that has no interior sound but presses gently against the glass. The planning of the day happens here, in this hour, not in the deliberate way of a person with a schedule and a desk and papers to consult, but in the loose, unhurried way of a person who is simply allowing the day to arrange itself in the mind before she enters it. What must happen today and in what order? What flexibility exists and where the fixed points are? What can be deferred if something unforeseen makes deferring necessary? The planning is not anxious. It is the light, competent review of someone who has made this kind of plan many times and trusts the review process because the review process has been adequate before. The children's lunches are assembled in a particular sequence that varies only when the available contents vary, which is regularly. The bread is sliced. 2 slices per child, the older children slightly thicker than the youngest's, though the youngest does not yet carry a lunch, and so this calculation is actually for 2. The filling is spread to the edge, which is a standard you observed from your own mother and have maintained because the bread that is unfilled at the edge is a bread that has been treated carelessly, and children know the difference. The sandwich is cut on the diagonal because one of the children has at some point become convinced that the diagonal cut makes the sandwich better, and you cannot prove the child wrong and are not inclined to try. The putting up of the lunch is accompanied by the memory of your own school lunches, carried in a similar pail, assembled by your own mother with the same or similar care. The continuity is not sentimental to you. It is simply there, a thread running from that kitchen to this one, from that mother's hands to yours, the same slight adjustment of the bread spreading, the same fold of the wax paper around the sandwich. The children will not know that their lunches are connected to that other kitchen. They do not need to know. The connection exists regardless of their knowing. By the time the children are leaving the house, the morning has advanced to the point where the light is fully established, and the street outside is in motion with the particular Wednesday morning or Thursday morning activity that distinguishes these middle week days from the bookend days of Monday and Friday. You watch through the window as the children walk up the street in the direction of the school, the eldest walking with the particular self-containment of someone who has decided to be taken seriously, the middle child occasionally running a few steps and then walking again, for reasons that are purely energetic rather than purposeful. The youngest waves from the front step for as long as the others are visible and then comes back inside. The silence that settles after they are gone has a different texture than the earlier silence, the silence before the household woke. The earlier silence was the silence of potential, of the day not yet having begun. This silence is the silence of the day underway, of everyone dispersed into their particular locations and occupations, of the house holding only you and the youngest for the hours ahead. It is a productive silence, a working silence, the silence of the day in full operation. You return to the kitchen, and you begin the morning's second phase. The breakfast dishes into the soapy water, the percolator emptied and rinsed, the surface of the stove wiped with the cloth kept for that purpose. These are the small completions of the morning routine, the closing of the parentheses opened at dawn. When they are done, the kitchen is ready for the day's main work, whatever that work is on this particular day. The baking, the laundry, the cleaning, the preserving, the 100 small and medium tasks that make up the household's continuous operation. The ration book lives in the second drawer of the kitchen dresser, underneath the dish towels, behind the rubber bands and the ball of twine. You know exactly where it is because you always know exactly where it is, the way you know where everything essential is kept, not by making an effort to remember, but because some things are simply too important to be placed anywhere that requires thought to locate. The ration book is a small thing, government issued, its cover printed with patriotic language about sacrifice and the common effort. The pages inside are divided into stamps, each one representing a quantity of something: sugar, meat, butter, coffee, cooking fats. And each time you use one, you tear it out and hand it across the counter at the grocery, and it is gone, and the balance shifts, and the arithmetic of the week must be recalculated accordingly. Feeding a family on rations is less about cooking than it is about mathematics and imagination, deployed simultaneously in service of making the meals that appear each day on the table feel, as much as possible, like abundance. You have become very good at this. You did not know before the war that you would be good at it. But necessity is a teacher with no patience for slow learning, and you have learned. The week begins with a survey. Sunday evening or Monday morning, it varies. You stand in the pantry and assess. You count the jars. You note what is running low and what is plentiful. You look at the ration stamps remaining and cross-reference this with the days of the week ahead and the meals each day will require. This is not done on paper. It is done in the mind, in that peculiarly female arithmetic that takes pleasure, in its way, in the solving of small, complex problems. Meat is the central constraint. The stamps allow for a certain weight per person per week, and this weight, divided across the meals that will feature meat, leaves you with portions that must be extended. You have learned to extend them. A smaller piece of beef, braised long and slow with onions and carrots and whatever root vegetables the garden has provided or the pantry holds, becomes a stew that fills the pot and fills the plates. The broth from the braising becomes the soup of the following day. The small amount of meat left from the soup bone goes into hash on Thursday morning, fried with potatoes and seasoned with whatever herb seems right. Nothing is wasted. The progression is so practiced that it feels like its own kind of art. Eggs do considerable work in a rationing household. An egg is protein, fat, binding agent, and the basis of any number of dishes that require only the addition of flour and salt and water or milk. An egg beaten into a dish of dried beans transforms the beans from peasant food into something closer to a complete meal. Eggs scrambled with yesterday's bread, and a scraping of bacon fat becomes a breakfast that satisfies. An egg used to bind a meatloaf, half ground beef, half breadcrumbs and grated carrot, stretches the meat across an extra 2 portions. You count your eggs not anxiously, but with the quiet precision of someone who understands their value. Potatoes are the daily bread of the 1940s kitchen. They are not rationed. They grow in the garden, or they can be bought in quantity when they are available, and they can be stored in the basement through the winter without requiring canning or preserving. A potato can be boiled, fried, baked, mashed, creamed, made into soup, made into pancakes, made into a kind of flat cake with onion that can be eaten for breakfast or supper equally. You know perhaps 20 ways to cook a potato, and the knowledge feels like wealth, like a private library of options available in any week regardless of what the ration book permits. The bread is baked on Tuesdays and sometimes again on Fridays if the first loaves have been eaten, or if there are visitors expected. You learn to bake bread from your mother, who learned from hers, in a chain of instruction that stretches back far enough that the knowledge itself seems to have no origin, seems to simply be part of what women in this family know the way they know how to walk. The yeast is kept in a small cool spot on the pantry shelf. The flour is in the large crock with the wooden lid. The mixing bowl is the largest one, cream-coloured, slightly chipped at the rim. You make bread by feel. You know when the dough is right, not by a measurement, but by a quality. The way it responds to your hands, the smoothness of it, the slight resistance when you press, and the return that indicates the gluten has developed. The kneading takes 10 minutes, and it is 10 minutes in which you think of other things, because your hands have been doing this so long they require no instruction. You think of what you will make for supper. You think of a letter you received last week. You think of nothing at all, and the dough rises and falls under your hands, and the kitchen fills with a particular warm smell of yeast working. The bread that emerges from the oven is the most satisfying product of the week. not because it is the most complex or the most skilled, but because it is so clearly the result of something you have done, beginning to end, with your own hands and your own knowledge, and because the response to it is so uncomplicated and genuine. Children eat fresh bread without being asked. They eat it plain, with only the butter that the ration allows, and they eat it with an appreciation that is involuntary. The bread is good. Everyone knows it is good. Nothing more needs to be said. There are tricks for making things taste like more than they are. Browning the onions slowly, not quickly, slowly until they soften and begin to caramelize and release a sweetness that no onion raw could suggest, transforms the base of any dish into something that carries depth and warmth. A scraping of fat from the crock where you save drippings from every meat ever cooked adds a richness to vegetables that cooked in water alone would lack. A handful of dried herbs from the garden, hung upside down in the summer and crumbled from their stems in winter, makes the kitchen smell like something being prepared with care, which it is. The government issues pamphlets. They come in the mail and they appear on the bulletin board at the church hall, and sometimes the woman at the grocery counter has a stack of them beside the register. The pamphlets are cheerful about rationing, full of recipes that promise that you will not notice the absence of this ingredient or that one, that substitutions are not sacrifices but discoveries, that cooking with less is an adventure and a patriotic contribution, and possibly even more delicious than what came before. You read them and you take what is useful and you disregard the cheerfulness, which is a quality that requires energy you cannot always spare. The truth is that you have always cooked carefully. The Depression came before the war, and before the Depression there were lean years for other reasons, and the habit of frugality was established long before the government printed it on the ration books. You were never the cook who poured things out. You were always the cook who saved things, who thought about next week while cooking this week, who kept the small ends of cheese and the last third of the jar of jam and the heel of the loaf because something could always be made of something. The recipes are in your head, or they are on cards in the wooden box with the hinged lid that sits on the second shelf of the pantry. The cards are written in different hands. Your own, your mother's, your grandmother's handwriting in pencil, faded but legible. Some of the cards are stained, which means they have been used with wet hands many times, which means the recipe is a good one. You trust the stained cards more than the clean ones. Feeding a family is an act of love that looks like logistics. This is something you understand but rarely articulate, because there is no occasion to articulate it, no conversation in which you would say such a thing. But you feel it, in the way you feel the other truths of your daily life, not as something discovered or arrived at through reflection, but as something simply known, the way you know the temperature of the kitchen without a thermometer, the way you know that the percolator is ready by the sound it makes. The food you put on the table is not merely nutrition, it is attention. It is the daily demonstration of the fact that you have thought about these people, have planned for their hunger, have turned what you had into what they needed. Supper is the meal that matters most. Breakfast is functional, lunch is brief, but supper is when the family assembles and sits together in the way that they do not assemble at any other time of day. The children must be seated before the food is brought to the table. The dishes are plain but clean, and the tablecloth, not the good one, the everyday one, covers whatever the table's surface might show. There is a ritual to the serving that you observe without thinking about it, the way all rituals are eventually observed. After supper comes the washing up, and after the washing up comes the evening, and somewhere in the accounting of the day's meals there is always the beginning of tomorrow's. What will be needed? What is almost gone? What must be started tonight so it is ready in the morning? The planning never fully stops. But it runs quietly, in the background of the evening, while the children do their schoolwork and the radio plays and the house settles into its nighttime self. The ration book is returned to the drawer at the end of the week when the stamps have been used or a new week's worth has been issued, and you make your notes on the envelope you keep behind it. What worked? What might be managed differently? What cannot be changed but must simply be accepted? You are, without anyone having given you the title, the household economist, the domestic strategist, the person on whom the week's sustenance depends. And the week holds. The family is fed, the bread is good, the stew is warm and the soup is nourishing, and the Wednesday night eggs are well seasoned, and the Sunday roast, smaller than it used to be, extended further than it would have once been extended, is real and satisfying, and the children eat it without complaint. This is what you have done. Every week you have done this. It is not a small thing. though it is called small, it is not easy, though it requires no praise. It is the daily act of keeping people alive and fed and warm in a time when the whole world is learning again how much it had been taking for granted. In the third week of April, when the ground has thawed enough to accept a hand trowel without resistance, the garden calls you. Not loudly, not urgently, but with the same particular insistence as any work that has been waiting through the long months when it could not be done. You go out in the morning still in your housecoat and apron just to look, to put your hands into the soil and feel what it is doing, whether it is ready. The soil in April is cool and dark and slightly wet from the snowmelt and the spring rains, and it has a smell that is unlike any other smell, mineral and alive at once, the smell of something beginning. You take a handful and feel it, the way your mother taught you to feel it, and it holds together when you press it and then crumbles when you release it. This is good. This means it is workable. This means the planting can begin. The garden is not large. A standard city lot in a residential neighbourhood allows perhaps a third of the backyard for growing, the rest given to the grass where the children play, and the clothesline and the small square of patio, where chairs are sometimes set out in the evenings. But the third of the yard given to the garden is carefully planned, because what it must produce is not ornamental but practical. It must justify its space in beans and tomatoes and carrots and beets and summer squash and whatever else the soil and the light and the length of the growing season will support. The planning of the garden happens in February, when the seed catalogues arrive. This is a particular pleasure of February, which has few pleasures. The catalogues come in their paper envelopes with their photographs of vegetables impossibly bright and perfect, as vegetables in catalogues always are, and you go through them with a pencil and a piece of paper making your list. Some seeds are saved from the year before, dried and labelled and kept in small paper envelopes in the cool dark of the pantry. The tomatoes you save every year, and the beans and sometimes the squash. The things you buy are the things that do not come true from saved seed, or the things you have decided to try for the first time. In May, after the last frost date has passed, and you know this date not from a calendar but from long experience, from the way the air smells in the 2 weeks before it, from the quality of the mornings, the seedlings that have been growing in the window of the spare bedroom since March are carried out to the garden. This is a careful operation. Tomato seedlings are fragile in their first days in the open air, and they must be hardened gradually, set outside for a few hours and then brought back in, until they have adjusted to the temperature and the wind. The beans and the squash are direct seeded into the ground, small furrows pressed with your finger, the seeds dropped in at intervals, covered, patted smooth. The summer that follows is a negotiation with weather and with time. The garden requires daily attention. Not long hours, but consistent small attention, the kind that prevents small problems from becoming large ones. You check for the beetles that destroy the beans and remove them by hand into a jar of soapy water. You stake the tomatoes as they grow, tying the heavy stems to the wooden stakes with strips of soft rag. You water in the evenings when the soil is dry, keeping the hose close to the ground so the leaves stay dry, because wet leaves are an invitation to the diseases that can take a tomato plant overnight. The children help, to varying degrees and with varying enthusiasm. They are useful for the harvesting of beans, which requires only the ability to identify a ripe bean, and the patience to go along the row without trampling the adjacent plants, and they find this tedious after a few minutes, but they do it. They are less useful for the weeding, which is harder to explain in terms that seem fair to a child, why this plant is a weed and that one is not, why the weed must come out at the root and not just be broken off at the stem, why thoroughness matters here in a way they cannot immediately see. You explain it anyway. The tomatoes come in August, all at once, the way summer vegetables always come, slowly, slowly, and then suddenly and without pause. The first ones you eat fresh, sliced and salted and laid on a plate, because the first tomato of the season is an event, a thing that has been anticipated, and to cook it would be to miss the point. But within a week there are more than can be eaten fresh, and the canning begins. Canning is the summer's most serious work. The equipment is assembled, the large pot, the rack that holds the jars off the bottom, the jars themselves washed and inspected for chips and cracks, the new lids in their box. Canning requires exactness. The jars must be sterilized. The processing time must be observed to the minute. The seal must be confirmed. You press the center of each lid when it has cooled and listen for the dull thud that means it is sealed. And you turn aside the ones that give a pop or a give, because those must be used immediately and cannot be stored. The sound of canning is the sound of late summer. The large pot on the stove, the steam, the jars rattling slightly in the water as they process, the timer ticking, the smell of hot tomatoes and spice and vinegar filling the kitchen until the windows cloud with condensation and the whole house smells like something being put away for safekeeping. You stand in this kitchen and you think, while your hands are occupied with lifting jars and setting lids, about the winter ahead. About opening one of these jars in December when the garden is only a memory under snow. You're building a bridge between seasons. You're making provision against scarcity. This is not dramatic, but it is not small either. The beans must be blanched and packed and processed. The beets must be pickled in a brine of vinegar and sugar and pickling spice, the kitchen turning briefly but intensely crimson as you work. The peaches, if the year has been kind and they are available at the roadside stands, must be peeled and halved and packed into syrup. The applesauce is made in early October when the apples are ripe, put up in the largest jars, the shelves finally beginning to fill with the stored abundance of what the summer has produced. The pantry in October holds everything the summer worked for. You count the jars sometimes in the evenings, not anxiously but with satisfaction, the way you might count a small fortune, not because you fear losing it, but because the counting itself is a pleasure. 64 quarts of green beans, 32 quarts of tomatoes, 24 pints of pickled beets, 16 pints of applesauce, 12 pints of peach preserves, 8 pints of cherry jam. The numbers are different every year, depending on what grew well and what was lost to weather or pest, but the assembling of them each fall is one of the year's most satisfying moments. The root vegetables go into the basement, into the bushel baskets on the floor where the temperature stays cool and steady through the winter. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets that were not pickled, onions braided on strings hung from the rafters, dried herbs from the garden, bundled and hung until they are ready to be crumbled into the small glass jars labelled in pencil. The basement in November smells like a root cellar, which is what it effectively is. Dark, cool, earthy, holding the concentrated smell of things grown and gathered. The work of the garden flows into the work of the pantry, the way one season flows into the next, without a clear boundary, without a decisive moment of transition. You are planting in April and by July you are already harvesting, and by September the harvesting and the preserving are happening simultaneously, and by October the preserving is mostly done, and the garden is being put to bed. The dead plants composted, the soil turned over, the beds left to rest under the first frosts. Putting the garden to bed for winter is a satisfying kind of work. You clear the beds of everything that will not survive the cold, turning the dead plants under, working the soil with the fork until it is loose and aerated. You lay a covering of leaves over the beds that need protection, the perennial herbs, the strawberry bed if you have one, and you tuck the garden in the way you tuck a child in, with attention and care and the understanding that rest is necessary before growth can begin again. In the winter the garden rests. Under the snow the soil does its slow underground work. The microbes and the worms continue. The organic matter breaks down and becomes the nutrients of next year. The garden is not dead in winter, it is gathering itself. And you are gathering too, going through the seed catalogues again when they arrive in February, making your list, planning what to grow differently, what to try for the first time. The cycle begins again before it has fully ended. The knowledge of the garden, what to grow, when to plant, how to care for what is growing, how to preserve what is harvested. This knowledge was not learned in school or from books. It passed from hand to hand through observation and instruction, from a grandmother who grew up in a place where growing food was not optional, to a mother who kept the practice when she moved to the city to you, and you carry it with that same unconscious competence, that sureness of hands and judgment that comes from having done something so many times that the body knows the steps before the mind has named them. Stand in the pantry for a moment. Run your hand along the shelf and feel the smooth glass of the jars. Look at the rows of them, the colours inside, the deep red of the tomatoes, the pale green of the beans, the jewelled crimson of the beets, the amber of the peach preserves, the dark near purple of the cherry jam. Each jar is a day of work. Each jar is a decision made in August about something needed in January. Each jar is an act of faith in the continuity of the household, in the carrying forward of life through the long winter, in the ordinary and sustaining miracle of keeping people fed. The pantry door closes softly. The kitchen is quiet. The garden outside the window is brown and silent under the November sky. But the shelves are full. The basement holds its roots and its hanging onions. The recipe cards in the wooden box know what to do with all of it. You have done what needed to be done. The winter can come. On Tuesday mornings, you hear Edna's screen door close at 8:30, and you know without looking that she's taking her laundry to the line. You know the sound of her door the way you know the sound of your own. A particular quality to the spring, a slight scrape at the bottom corner that has been that way for as long as you can remember. You have never mentioned that you know her door by sound. She has never mentioned that she knows yours. The women of the neighbourhood exist in a web of awareness that is never formally acknowledged and rarely discussed. You know who rises early and who sleeps late. You know whose children are troubled and whose are easy. You know when someone is sick because their wash does not go up on wash day and their house stays quiet. You know when things are harder than usual, by the way. A woman carries herself down the front walk, by the speed at which she answers her door, by the small delays in responses that would normally be immediate. This knowledge does not require conversation. It is assembled from observation, from the accumulated evidence of days and weeks and years of proximity, from the particular attentiveness that comes from living in close contact with other lives. The women of this block have watched each other's children learn to walk, watched each other's houses through the changing seasons, noted each other's small victories and unspoken defeats. It is a kind of intimacy that has no name and requires no declaration. It simply exists, like the neighbourhood itself. The easiest way to understand it is through borrowing. Borrowing, in 1940s America, is a living institution, a continuous low-level exchange of goods and assistance that functions as an informal insurance against small daily emergencies. You run out of flour on a Thursday when the grocery's closed. You're short a cup of sugar for the cake you promised to bring to the church social. The baby's formula is low and your husband does not come home until 6. You knock on Edna's door, or on Ruth's door, or on the door of the woman whose name you're always slightly embarrassed to realize you must pause to recall, and you ask, and you receive, and you return it when you can, and the whole transaction is conducted in the minor key of women helping each other through the small daily crises that men rarely see, and systems never address. The borrowing is not about scarcity alone, it is also about connection. The cup of sugar is an occasion. It requires a moment at the door, a few words, the brief crossing of a threshold. In a life where the days are spent largely within the house, and within the immediate neighbourhood, these small crossings matter. They are the social fabric, held together not by the dramatic moments, the births and deaths and crises, but by the ordinary and repeated small exchanges that accumulate over years into something that feels permanent and solid and good. Ruth is the practical one. She is the woman you call when something has gone wrong in a practical sense, when the drain is slow, or the furnace makes a sound it has not made before, or something has been spilled on something important. Ruth has a gift for problem solving that comes from a long marriage to a man who worked and left and worked, and from having raised 3 children with limited resources and considerable resourcefulness. She arrives at your door with a bucket and a plan, and she does not make you feel inadequate for having needed her. This is a skill not everyone has. Edna is the one you call for the other kind of emergency, when you have received a difficult letter, when a child has said something that has stayed with you, when the day has been the kind of day that must be spoken of to someone before it can be released. Edna sits at your kitchen table and drinks coffee and listens in a way that is active and engaged but not intrusive. She asks the right question at the right moment and knows when to ask nothing. This too is a skill. It is perhaps the more uncommon one. The relationship between the women of the neighbourhood includes the children, and often the children's relationship to other women becomes as important as their relationship to their own mother. The concept of the whole street's women keeping a general eye has never been articulated as a principle. It is simply what happens. A child in trouble, a child who has wandered too far, a child who is sick and whose mother is unreachable. These situations resolve themselves through the network of women's attention without a committee being formed or a policy being established. Someone steps in. Someone always steps in. There are things that women discuss only with other women, not because they are secret necessarily, but because they are simply not things that travel in the other direction with ease. the particular exhaustion of the days when nothing goes right, the strange grief of a child who no longer needs you in the way they once did, the management of a household on an income that is not quite enough, the arithmetic of that, the small indignities of it, the body's changes over years, the way the face in the mirror becomes gradually unfamiliar. These things circle in the conversations that happen over the back fence, over coffee at the kitchen table, in the quiet moment while hanging laundry, when no one is within earshot except the woman at the next line. The church brings them together in a more formal way, once or twice a week, in the fellowship hall or the parlour, or wherever the women's auxiliary meets. These meetings have a stated purpose: the collection drive, the bake sale, the visiting committee for the sick and the bereaved. And the stated purpose is real and is accomplished, but it is also the occasion, the potluck that precedes the meeting proper, the chairs arranged in the circle that will hold the conversation, the coffee urn and the plates of cookies that someone has brought. The meeting happens, and the real business of the meeting, the maintenance of the web, the checking in with all the members of the web, also happens, running parallel and sometimes more important. There are hierarchies in the neighbourhood, though they are not fixed and not formal. Certain women are recognised as authorities, on cooking, on child-rearing, on the management of difficult situations, and their opinions carry weight without being enforced. A woman who has raised 5 children to adulthood in the neighbourhood knows something, and her knowing is respected. A woman who has kept her household solvent through the Depression, and is now keeping it solvent through the war knows something, and this knowing has a kind of status that no title confers. There are also women who struggle, whose households are not as steady, whose situations are harder, whose resources are stretched in ways that the others quietly observe and, where possible, quietly address. This is not done through charity exactly. The concept of charity implies a distance between giver and receiver that does not exist among neighbours who have shared years and weather and the minor dramas of ordinary life. It is done through the ordinary mechanisms of the web, the extra jar of preserves left at the door without explanation, the invitation to Sunday dinner when the extra expense of it is absorbed without comment, the willingness to take someone's child for the afternoon, so that afternoon can be used for something that needs doing. The shared meals are important. Not elaborate meals, not meals that require a special occasion to justify the gathering. The informal meal, the coffee and cake in the afternoon, the soup that was made in too large a quantity and must be shared before it goes off. The sharing of food is among the oldest human gestures, and it retains, even in the middle of an ordinary week in a mid-century American neighbourhood, all of its original meaning. To feed someone is to say, you are cared for, you're seen, there is enough here for you. The conversations that happen over food are different from other conversations. Something in the sharing of a meal, in the passing of the bread and the pouring of the coffee, relaxes the usual careful management of presentation that governs the more public exchanges. Women say things over kitchen tables that they would not say standing at the mailbox. They are more direct about difficulty. They are more likely to express the feelings that do not have obvious solutions, and therefore are kept out of the conversations where solutions are expected. During the war years, the neighbourhood's web stretches to accommodate new weight. There are women whose husbands are overseas. There are women waiting for letters, waiting for news, managing the household alone in a way they had not anticipated. There are women whose fear lives just below the surface of every ordinary day, who open the door with a particular readiness to be devastated that they cannot quite set down, even when the news is not the news they dread. These women are held by the web in a way that requires no discussion. The neighbour brings dinner on Tuesday. The neighbour takes the children for a Saturday morning. The neighbour sits and listens to the letter that has arrived, and does not offer comfort that would be false, but offers only presence, which is true. You are part of this. You are one thread in this web, neither the strongest nor the most peripheral. You bring casseroles, and you receive cups of sugar. You listen to Edna, and you are listened to by Ruth. You watch the children of the whole street with the same general attention you give your own. You are part of something that has no name and no formal structure, but that is as real and as load-bearing as anything in this neighbourhood, including the houses themselves. It is a kind of society that the official world cannot quite see, because it does not produce receipts or minutes or any ledger that would allow it to be counted. But it is there, every day, in the quiet exchange of small things and small attentions, and the accumulated weight of women knowing each other's lives. It is there in the sound of Edna's screen door at 8:30 on Tuesday mornings. It is there in the particular way the block holds its breath, when a car turns onto the street in Wartime and the driver slows too much, looking for a house number, and every woman in earshot goes still until the car passes on. The web holds, as it always has, as it must. There are children in the neighbourhood who are not the children of anyone you know well, children who are simply the children of the street, present in the daily landscape the way the trees and the lampposts are present. You know them by sight and by family association, know who belongs to which house, know the rough hierarchy of ages that determines which children play with which other children in the late afternoons. You watch them with the particular alert attention of someone who holds herself partly responsible for any child within her field of observation, regardless of formal relationship. This is not stated anywhere, it is simply understood. The collection of aluminum for the war effort brings the neighbourhood's children together in an organised way that produces, as a side effect, a remarkable social efficiency. The children go in groups from house to house, carrying the collected cans in wagon loads to the central collection point at the end of the block, and in the going and the coming back there are conversations and alliances and small negotiations that cross the usual grade level and family line divisions that otherwise organise the children's social world. This is not noticed by anyone as a sociological phenomenon. It is simply what happens when children are given a collective task. The women of the neighbourhood are not uniform in their characters and not uniform in their struggles. There are women here who are better matched to this particular life, the domestic, the neighbourhood-centred, the child-focused life, than others. There are women here who would have thrived in a different arrangement, who have gifts that the arrangement does not use or does not notice. You know this about some of them. Know it from the conversations in which a particular intelligence or particular ability surfaces and is recognised and then set back into the ordinary context without comment. The recognition is real. The acknowledgement is internal. The conversation continues about the practical matter it was nominally about. This is how things were. This is not the whole of how things are. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The letters arrive without pattern. This is the first thing you learn, and the learning of it is itself a lesson in the particular geography of wartime, in what it means to wait for something that cannot be scheduled. A letter might come Tuesday, or not until the following Monday, or not for 3 weeks and then 2 on the same day, the envelope slightly battered from travel, smelling of something you cannot name, the handwriting familiar and yet somehow altered by distance. You become an expert in envelopes. You can read the condition of an envelope, whether it has been handled by many hands, whether it has sat in a mail pouch in heat or cold, how long ago the stamp was moistened, and from this reading you calculate approximately how old the words inside are. A letter written on March the 4th and received on March the 29th contains words that are already 25 days old when you first read them. This gap, which is nothing in peacetime and everything now, becomes a permanent condition of your thinking. You're always reading slightly into the past. The letter writing has its own ritual, begun in the evening after the children are in bed, when the house has quieted to its nighttime register. You bring the writing paper, the good notepaper, pale blue, bought before the war when such things could still be bought without apology, and the fountain pen that was a wedding gift and has lived in the drawer of the bureau since then. You sit at the dining room table, which is cleared and wiped and better lit than the kitchen table. You think before you write. What you write and what you do not write are equally considered. You write cheerful things, or at least honest things made gentle in the telling. You write about the children, their weight, their words, their small achievements, and their small troubles, made light. You write about the garden, about the neighbours, about the news from church. You do not write about the fear. You do not write about the nights when sleep will not come, and you lie still in the dark listening for something that has no sound. You understand that your letters must not add weight to a weight you cannot see and cannot address. You carry your fear yourself. He writes back with the same care, the same calibration between truth and protection. His letters tell you about the weather, about the food, about the men he's gotten to know, rendered in detail that tells you he is observing carefully and wants you to see what he sees. He does not write about what frightens him. You know this without being told. You are both performing the same act of love at distance in opposite directions, holding back the worst so that the other can continue. There is a woman on the next block whose husband has been in the Pacific since 1942. She checks the mailbox twice a day, though delivery comes only once. You have seen her do it. The walk down the front path in the morning, the opening of the lid, the checking, the slight alteration in the body's posture that tells you whether there was something inside or not. You do not say anything about this. You understand it too completely to require comment. The news comes through the radio and through the newspapers, and you follow it the way you follow anything that contains a person you love. Not entirely, not without protection, but closely and attentively, with one part of your mind always doing the calculation of where and what that means in terms of distance and proximity. Certain place names become weighted with significance that they would not carry for anyone without someone in the war. A city, a region, a river or a mountain range becomes a word that you hear differently from the announcer than your neighbours might hear it. It has a personal dimension that cannot be shared and cannot be explained. The worry has a physical quality. You feel it in the chest, in the particular shallow breathing of the nights when the news has been bad from a region that is close to where you believe him to be. You feel it in the heaviness of the Sundays when the church service asks the congregation to hold in prayer all those far from home, and you hold him, specifically, particularly the exact person, his hands and his voice, and the way he clears his throat before saying something he has been thinking about for a while, and you hold him as carefully as you have ever held anything. The children carry the war differently than you do. They know he is away. They know it is because of something large and important, something the radio talks about and the school teachers mention, and the posters on the post office wall depict. They miss him in the concrete ways of children. They miss Saturday mornings. They miss the particular roughness of his chin when he kisses them goodnight. They miss the specific timbre of his laughter at the supper table. Their missing is present and immediate rather than abstract and chronological. They do not lie awake calculating distance. They simply want him here, now, in the kitchen, in the way he was before. You manage this, their missing, in addition to your own. This is perhaps the hardest part of the waiting, the loneliness of carrying your fear alone, without the person who would normally share the carrying of heavy things, and simultaneously holding the children's sadness and their confusion and their ordinary needs against the backdrop of your own. You do it without complaining, which is not the same as finding it easy. It is hard. You simply do hard things. The women of the neighbourhood who are in the same position recognise each other without needing to speak of it. There is something in the eyes, perhaps, some quality of the careful attentiveness of a person who is always slightly listening for news, not the news on the radio, which is general, but the news of a particular person. When two such women speak, they can be honest in a way that is not possible with the women whose husbands are home. Not to be dramatic, not to catastrophize, but simply to acknowledge the reality of it without the social pressure to be reassured. The collection drives give the waiting something to do. Aluminum for aircraft, rubber for tyres, fat drippings saved from the kitchen and taken to the collection point, a contribution so small it would be easy to dismiss, but which is taken seriously because taking it seriously is a way of participating, a way of reaching across the distance between the home and the theatre of war with something that is yours and might help. You save the fat, you flatten the tin cans, you grow the victory garden with a diligence that goes beyond the practical need for food, because it is a way of being useful in a situation where usefulness is hard to locate. The letters sometimes take strange turns. A letter written in winter arrives in spring. A letter written in what must have been a good week, full of lightness, arrives on a week when the news from that region has been heavy and the contrast is disorienting. The man in the letter is fine, or was fine when the letter was written, and what he's now cannot be known. You hold the letter and you read it twice. You fold it along its original creases and you put it in the box where the letters are kept, the wooden box that sits on the shelf above the bedroom dresser. The box grows heavier through the months. By winter it is substantial, a weight in itself, a small archive of a particular kind of love. The children sometimes ask to hear the letters. You read them the parts that are written for children, the jokes, the descriptions of strange foods, the questions he poses directly to them, which arrive weeks after the events they ask about, and to which the answers must be written back into the next letter. Another loop in the long loop of wartime correspondence. The children listen, and then they go back to their play, which is children's way of processing what they cannot yet fully understand. There are prayer services on Wednesday evenings at the church. You go. Not every week. Some weeks the children are sick, or the weather is bad, or the day has been the kind of day that makes the idea of one more thing impossible. But many weeks. You sit in the pew and you listen to the prayers offered for the men overseas, and you add your own, silent, particular, addressed to the specific person rather than the general cause. The silence between letters is its own thing. It is not empty. It is full of the ongoing management of daily life, the children and the kitchen and the garden and the neighbourhood, the full density of a life that continues while the other life is somewhere else, doing things you cannot see and cannot know. But the silence also holds the absence, the chair at the supper table that has a different weight now that no one is sitting in it, the side of the bed that you do not sleep on, not because you are keeping it, but because old habit is a powerful thing and the body knows its territory even when the territory has changed. One day, and this is the hope that runs beneath every day, quiet and essential, the waiting will end. The letters will stop because distance will stop. He will come back. The chair will hold someone again. The silence between letters will become simply silence, the ordinary silence of a house where everyone is asleep and the night is quiet, and the danger is only the ordinary danger of ordinary life. For now, you wait. You wait the way women have always waited, not passively, not with folded hands, but actively, living fully in the days of the waiting, managing everything that must be managed, caring for everyone who must be cared for, carrying your fear quietly, and your love plainly, and your hope like a small fire in the chest that you tend with the same patient attention you give everything in this life that matters and is yours to keep alive. The letter writing itself becomes a practice of attention. You sit at the dining room table with the blue notepaper and the fountain pen, and you try to be present to yourself, to gather what the days have held and compress it into the shape of a letter that will travel across the ocean and arrive in a hand that will read it in a place you cannot see. The effort of this is not in the writing. You have always written well, have always found words that approximate what you mean, but in the selection. What to include, what to leave out, what will comfort and what, however innocent, might worry. The selection requires a continuous calibration that is its own kind of emotional labour. You write about ordinary things because ordinary things are what you have. The middle child's latest project, which involves an elaborate construction in the backyard about which you are uncertain but supportive. The progress of the tomatoes, which are coming in earlier than usual this year and in greater quantity than you had anticipated, which means canning on a scale you had not planned for. The neighbour's new arrangement with the milk, which you describe with more detail than the detail warrants, but which produces 2 paragraphs of solid material and gives a specific picture of the specific place and time that you want the letter to convey. You want the letter to smell like this kitchen. You want the letter to be so particular to this life that reading it is almost like being in it. The censors open some letters and read them before they are delivered. You know this. You write with the knowledge that your words may be read by a stranger, before they are read by the person for whom they are written. And this knowledge creates a particular restraint, not about the personal, which the censors do not care about, but about anything that might be construed as containing information about troop movements or locations or other things that the censors are specifically looking for. You have no such information and no desire to transmit it, but the knowledge of the censor's eyes gives the letters a slightly formal quality at their edges, a consciousness of being read by more than one person. There are letters you receive that have been opened and resealed. The evidence of the opening visible if you look for it. You do look for it, not from suspicion, but from the need to know whether the letter you hold is the letter as it was written, or whether something has been removed between the writing and the receiving. Most of the time nothing has been removed. Most of the time the letter is intact, and the opening has been purely confirmatory, and the words inside are the words as they were put down. But once a letter arrives from which something is missing, not struck through, simply absent, a gap in the narrative that makes you read it twice before you understand that what is missing was removed, not forgotten. You do not know what it was. You will never know. You fold the letter along its original creases and you put it in the box and you write the next one. The box of letters on the shelf above the bedroom dresser grows through the months, adding weight and volume at the irregular rhythm of correspondence. Some weeks 2 letters arrive in close succession, written days apart but travelling the same route and arriving together, giving you the strange pleasure of reading the second before the events it describes have happened in the first. Other weeks nothing arrives, and you note the absence without catastrophizing it, telling yourself the things that are likely to be true. The post is erratic, the routes are long, letters are lost and delayed, and sometimes simply take more time than they should. The not arriving of a letter is not news. It is only the not arriving of a letter. Other women in the neighbourhood are navigating the same correspondence, the same waiting, the same calibrated management of information given and received. You do not compare notes extensively. The letters are private, and the private nature of them is respected without discussion. But there is an understanding among the waiting women that you share a condition, a particular texture of daily life, that those whose households are complete do not share. The understanding needs no articulation. It is present in the small extra consideration these women extend to each other, in the willingness to take on an extra task or extend an extra kindness without being asked, because asking is sometimes the hardest part. The youngest wakes at 6, sometimes earlier, with a certainty about the readiness of the world that adults have long since lost. There is no ambivalence in a small child's waking, one moment asleep and the next fully present, the eyes open and the mind already pursuing some thread of thought or desire that has no patience for transition. You hear the first sounds from the crib, the small investigating sounds that precede the call, and you are already half risen before the call comes, your body having made the decision before you were fully awake. The work of raising children is the longest and most complex of the household's labours, and it is the one least reducible to method or sequence. The cooking can be learned. The canning can be systematized. The laundry has a logic. But children resist all of these. They are not problems to be solved, but persons to be known. And knowing them requires a different quality of attention, one that is less procedural and more intuitive, more responsive, more willing to be surprised. The youngest is 2. The middle child is 6. The eldest is 9 and has begun to achieve, in the first tentative ways, the kind of separateness that is the goal of childhood and the bittersweet gift of parenthood. The eldest reads alone now, for long stretches in the armchair by the window, a quality of self-sufficiency that fills you with pride and with the first faint precursor of missing, that comes when a child begins to need you in fewer ways. You allow it. You must allow it. The allowing is part of the work. Each child is distinct, and the distinctions require different responses from you. The youngest wants company, wants to be held in arms or at least within sight, wants reassurance through presence that the world is continuous and stable, and that you are in it. The middle child is all motion and curiosity, wants to know how everything works, wants to be part of whatever you're doing, trails behind you in the kitchen asking questions about the stove and the spices and why the bread rises. The eldest wants conversation now, wants to be taken seriously, wants to offer opinions and have them considered rather than simply received. You give each of them what each of them needs, which requires holding several different registers at once. The practical care of children is continuous and sensory. Noses to wipe, hands to wash, shoes to tie, hair to brush with the small protest that hair teeing always generates, cuts to be cleaned and bandaged. The middle child in particular comes in weekly with some new abrasion, knees or elbows, or wants the palm of the hand in a way that required more than a bandage. Food to be prepared and offered, sometimes refused, sometimes eaten with enthusiasm that has nothing to do with the food's quality, and everything to do with the child's current relationship to hunger and mood. Baths on the appointed evenings, the bathroom crowded and warm and steaming, the battle over hair washing conducted with the same arguments on both sides every time, ending always the same way. The stories are part of it. Not the organised reading of books, though that happens too. The library is visited on Saturdays and the children each have their pile on the nightstand. But the less formal storytelling that happens in the spaces of the day. A story told while peeling carrots to hold a child's attention. A story told at bedtime, not from a book but from memory or invention, to ease the transition from waking to sleep. You are a better storyteller than you would have known yourself to be before children, because children require stories, and so you have learned to make them, to feel for the shape of a narrative that will hold a child's attention without overstimulating it, that will move at the right pace through the right events and arrive at a satisfying end. The emotional holding is harder to describe than the physical care, but it's equally continuous. A child's emotions are weather, shifting, sometimes violent, always real, requiring navigation rather than suppression. When the middle child is furious about something that seems small but is enormous, In the scale of a 6-year-old's world, you try to remember the scale. You try to receive the fury without reflecting it back or diminishing it. Sometimes you succeed. Sometimes you are tired and you diminish it anyway, and you know in the moment that you have done the wrong thing and the knowledge sits with you until you have an opportunity to correct it. The youngest cries for reasons that are not always identifiable. This is the particular challenge of the 2-year-old. The feeling is real and the expression is clear, the cry is unambiguous, but the cause is not always readable. You move through the possibilities: hunger, fatigue, pain, fear, loneliness, the desire for something specific that cannot be named. You try the things and you watch the response and you gradually triangulate toward what is needed. This process has no steps. It is simply attention, the same deep and patient attention you bring to the garden and the bread and the stove, applied to a small person. There are days when patience is hard to locate, days when the children are fighting with each other in the escalating way that brothers and sisters fight, where each provocation is slightly worse than the one before, and the adult must intervene before it crosses some threshold. Days when the middle child does the same dangerous thing for the 3rd time despite the same warning given each of the 3 times. Days when the youngest is crying, and the eldest is complaining, and something is burning on the stove and the neighbours at the door and everything's happening at once, in the particular way that everything happens at once in houses with children. On those days you draw on something that is not exactly patience. Patience implies a weight, implies that the end of the difficulty is visible from where you stand. What you draw on is more like endurance, the understanding that the difficulty is temporary, that this particular configuration of demands will resolve, that in 10 minutes or an hour or by tomorrow the storm will have passed. You carry this knowledge even on the days when it does not feel like knowledge, when it feels more like faith, a belief in the resolution of the present difficulty based not on evidence, but on the accumulated experience of having gotten through every previous one. The children's play is one of the household sounds. Through the window, through the walls, through the floor, the sounds of children at play reach you wherever you are in the house. The thud of running feet, the specific cry that is play crying and the specific cry that is not. The escalation of voices in a game that has become competitive. The sudden silence that sometimes means concentration and sometimes means something has happened that must be investigated. You have developed a taxonomy of the household sounds, and the children's sounds are among the most complex, the ones that most require interpretation rather than simply hearing. They also have quiet times, mornings when the eldest reads and the middle child draws on whatever paper can be found, and the youngest sleeps an extra hour, and the house has a quality of absorbed occupation that is nearly as peaceful as an empty house but warmer. You work in the kitchen or in the garden and you listen to the quiet and you think, in a non-specific and pleasant way, about nothing in particular. This is rest, a form of it, the kind available to you in the middle of a working day. The teaching is ongoing and requires no schedule. You teach the middle child to measure flour, demonstrating the way to level the cup with the straight edge of a knife. You teach the eldest to sew on a button, beginning with the demonstration, and then guiding the needle through the fabric and then watching, hands folded while the attempt is made. You teach the youngest to put toys in the box, one at a time, with the repetitive patience of someone who understands that the teaching of small children is largely a matter of doing the same thing many times until the doing becomes theirs. The children are learning all the time, not just in school and not just from the formal lessons you offer, but from watching you. This is the understanding that comes over you sometimes in the middle of an ordinary task, that the way you move through the house, the way you speak to the neighbours, the way you handle difficulty and effort and waiting, all of it is a lesson that the children are absorbing through sheer proximity. You are teaching the texture of a life. You do not know exactly what they will retain and what will fall away, but you try to make it something worth keeping. There are particular pleasures in the care of children that are not separable from the difficulties. The pleasure of a small hand in yours on the walk to the grocery store, the pleasure of reading aloud to all 3 of them in the evening, finding the right voice for each character, watching their faces change as the story moves, the pleasure of a sleeping child, the quality of peace in a sleeping child that is unlike any other peace, the complete and profound rest of a small body that has spent everything it had on the day and is now rebuilding for tomorrow. You hold them. This is the essential and irreducible act. Not only in the literal sense, the lifting and cradling and carrying that the youngest still requires, the shoulder that the eldest sometimes leans against in a moment of tiredness, the hand that reaches without thinking for the middle child's hand at the street corner. But in the larger sense too, you hold their whole lives, all three of them, in the circle of your attention, the full extent of your care. You know their health and their fears and their friendships and their progress at school and their night terrors and their food preferences and their growing feet. You hold all of it, all the time, and the holding is the work. The holding is what love looks like from the inside. Monday is wash day. It has always been wash day, and the tradition of Monday as the day set aside for laundry is old enough that it feels almost natural, like the particular quality of Monday light, the way the week opens with the task that will take the entire day if done properly, and the entire morning if done quickly. You begin before the children are awake, filling the boiler on the stove with water from the cold tap, a process that takes several trips with the large pot because the tap is not connected to the boiler directly, and filling it by hand is the only way it is done. The laundry of a family of 4.5 is substantial. It has its categories and its sequence, a sequence as fixed as the order of ingredients in a recipe, because the sequence matters. The lightest and cleanest things go in first, when the water is hottest and cleanest, and the darker and more soiled things go in last, when the water has already done its hardest work. Whites first, then the children's school clothes, then the everyday things, then the work things, the things that have been out in the world all week. The washboard is zinc, set into its wooden frame. The action of the washboard is essentially percussion. You lift the garment, press it against the corrugated surface, work it up and down with both hands, lifting and pressing, until the grime has been loosened from the fibre and carried away by the water. For the heavier items, or the overalls, the work trousers, the kitchen rugs, this takes several minutes of concentrated effort. For the lighter things it is quicker, but nothing passes without its time on the board. The wringer, which is either attached to the wash tub or is a separate device depending on the year and the house, takes the wrung-out clothes and expresses the remaining water, pressing the wet fabric between its two rollers so that what comes out the other side is damp rather than dripping. Threading the clothes through the wringer requires a certain care. A button caught in the rollers can be stripped, a strap or a collar can come through, twisted in a way that sets a crease that will not come out. You feed things through with attention, straightening and smoothing as you go. Outside, if the day is fair. The line is in the backyard strung between two wooden posts, and the clothes go up in an order that reflects both efficiency and aesthetics. Sheets first, the largest items, taking up the most line, but also catching the most wind and drying fastest. Then the shirts, buttoned once to hold their shape, then the children's things, hung by their waistbands, the small trousers and pinafores and nightgowns dancing in the wind in a way that has always seemed to you to convey something about children themselves, that restless, purposeless, joyful motion. Socks go on the inner lines, out of sight from the street, because there are things that belong to private life, and things that belong to the public presentation of the household. The smell of line-dried laundry is one of the year's pleasures, different in summer and in autumn, but always good. Always the smell of outdoors carried into the intimate domestic sphere. In summer it is warm and slightly grassy. In autumn it carries a sharpness from the cool air, something almost mineral, and the sheets dried on autumn afternoons have a quality of coolness retained even after they have been warmed by a body. You smooth them onto the beds in the evening and there is the smell of the afternoon in them. In winter, when the weather will not allow line drying, the laundry must be hung inside, on the rope strung in the basement, or on the wooden racks that stand in the kitchen and the parlour, steam rising from the drying clothes and adding moisture to the dry winter air that is, in its own way, a side benefit. The inside drying has its own smell, not the outdoor smell, but closer, more domestic. The smell of wet wool and cotton warming near the stove, which becomes the smell of winter domesticity. The ironing comes later, on Tuesday or sometimes Wednesday, when the clothes are dry and have been gathered in and piled. The iron is heavy, the kind that must be heated on the stove if it is the older type, or that runs from an electrical outlet if you are in a house that has been updated in this way. Either way it requires heat, a careful, managed heat, different for different fabrics. Cotton and linen can bear the full heat. Wool requires a damp cloth between the iron and the fabric. Silk is handled barely at all. The ironing of a shirt is a small technical achievement. You begin with the collar, which must lie flat when worn, and must therefore be pressed with particular attention to the collar points. ironed from the tip inward so the points do not fold over, then the cuffs, then each sleeve, laid flat and smoothed before the iron reaches them so no wrinkle is pressed in that was not already there, then the back, then each front panel, then the placket and the buttons navigated around. The finished shirt, removed from the board and held up for inspection, is good work, the kind of work whose quality is immediately visible. Mending is the occupation that runs alongside laundry and ironing in the category of clothing care, and it happens throughout the week as the need arises. A button comes off, you sew it back on. A seam comes open, you re-sew it, backstitch, stronger than the original. A knee goes through a child's trousers. You cut a patch from the worn trousers that cannot be repaired further, sew it over the hole with the same thread as the original garment if you have it, with a close matching thread if you do not. The patch is not invisible. It is not meant to be invisible. It is meant to be strong. The darning basket sits beside the chair in the parlour, filled at all times with things that need attention. Socks are the most frequent occupants. The heel of a sock goes thin before anything else, because the heel takes the most abrasion, and the darning of a sock heel is a particular skill that your grandmother had, and that you learned by watching, the way you learned most of the practical skills of your life. The darning mushroom, a wooden tool shaped exactly as its name suggests, smooth and oval, is inserted inside the sock, the worn area stretched over its dome, and the darning thread is woven back and forth across the gap, making a new fabric in the place where the old fabric has worn away. There is something meditative about mending. The needle moves in its repetitions, over and under and over and under, and the mind is occupied just enough to prevent it from wandering to the things that cause anxiety, but not so occupied that deeper, more ruminative thinking cannot occur. You think about what needs to be planned. You think about the children. You think about letters received and letters to be written. The mending basket empties and refills over the course of a week, never quite empty, never quite overwhelming, a perpetual small occupation for the hands. The household's clothing is managed across its entire lifespan. A garment does not simply wear out and disappear. It is worn while new, then worn for every day, then worn for work around the house, then cut down for a child or remade into something else, then cut into rags for cleaning, then used as stuffing or packing, or as the strips of cloth that go into braided rugs. The fabric's life follows the same cycle as the garden. Nothing is wasted, everything has a next use. The end of one purpose is the beginning of another. Some things last decades. The work trousers that your husband's father wore repaired so many times that the original fabric exists only in the non-repaired sections, which is now less than half of the whole. The quilt on the spare bed, made before you were born from the good parts of dresses that were themselves made from the good parts of other things. The tablecloth, edged in crocheted lace made by your grandmother, washed so many times the colour has gone from cream to white, mended in 3 places, still used for Sunday dinner. The objects of the household have a weight beyond their physical weight. They hold time. They hold the hands of other women who cared for them. The quilt is a record of decisions made by your grandmother, which piece to keep and which to use, visible in the pattern of the patches, in the particular fabrics laid against each other. The tablecloth holds your grandmother's hands in its lace edge, every loop the product of a specific motion made by a specific person on a specific evening. You use these things and they are useful, and they are also more than useful. When the clothing is worn beyond repair, beyond reuse, beyond everything, the very final rags, it is let go without ceremony, because ceremony would be excessive for a piece of cloth. But there is, in the letting go of something that has been in the household for a long time, a brief acknowledgement, a moment of recognition. This thing was here and did its work and is now finished. You fold the last rags into the bin, and you close the bin, and you return to what must be done next. The work returns. This is perhaps the most defining quality of the household's work, its return. The laundry, washed and dried and ironed and folded and put away, will need to be washed again within the week. The floor swept today will need sweeping tomorrow. The meals cooked and eaten will need to be cooked again. Nothing is done once and finished. Everything circles back. This could feel like futility, and on the hardest days, briefly, it does. But most days it feels like something else, like continuity, like the rhythm of something living, like the way breathing is not futile even though you must do it again and again and again without end. The evening begins before supper is finished. in the way that one thing in a household always begins before the previous thing has ended. You are still at the table, still watching the children eat, still attentive to the conversation that happens at the supper table, and to the particular quality of the conversation that tells you whether it was a good day or a difficult one and where the fault lines might be. But another part of you has already moved forward, is already in the kitchen beginning the washing up, is already calculating what must be done before the children are in bed and what can wait until morning. The clearing of the table is the household's evening ritual. The children know their part. The plates carried to the kitchen, the glasses carried carefully, the napkins taken to the hamper. The eldest does this reliably now. The middle child does it with varying degrees of thoroughness depending on the quality of the evening. The youngest is allowed to carry only the things that will not break if dropped, and the youngest contribution is celebrated regardless of its completeness, because the celebration is part of the teaching. The washing up in the evening is different from the mornings. The mornings is light, the breakfast things, the cups and plates and spoons of an uncomplicated meal. The evenings carries more. The supper dishes, the cooking pots, the casserole dish if there was one, the roasting pan, the baking dish. The water in the basin starts clear and hot and ends grey and cooling, and you work through it steadily, rinsing into the second basin where the cold water keeps things from being set with soap. The kitchen is the last room of the day, and the washing up is the last task, the completion of the cycle that began this morning at the stove. While you wash, the children do their schoolwork at the kitchen table. The eldest has reading and sometimes arithmetic. The middle child has simpler things, letters to form, numbers to practice, done with the pencil held too tightly, the face bent close to the paper in concentration. The youngest is past the age of afternoon naps now but still tires by early evening, and by the time the schoolwork is being put away, the youngest is already slow and heavy-lidded, leaning against whatever is adjacent, which is most often you. The homework is reviewed without red marks, or at least without the urgency of error correction that would upset the evening's mood. You sit beside the eldest and you look at the pages and you ask questions rather than giving corrections, because the questions keep the child's mind working, and the corrections, if needed, land more softly when they arrive through inquiry. This was not something you were taught. It is something you figured out through the natural trial and error of being someone's parent. The bedtime hour has its own particular mood, softer than the rest of the day, slower. The baths are done and the children are in their nightclothes and they smell of soap and warmth, and there is a quality to them at this hour that is gentler than at any other. The day's energy spent, the defences down, the child most fully itself in the tired and clean softness of pre-sleep. You sit on the edge of the youngest's bed and you tell the story that the youngest has requested, which is often the same story requested the night before and the night before that, because small children love repetition in stories the way they love repetition in routines, for the comfort of the known. The middle child wants to talk at bedtime. This is the time when things come out that did not come out during the day, things that were held through the daylight hours for reasons the child could not articulate and does not need to articulate. A worry about something at school, a confusion about something overheard, a question about something that happened long ago and has only now been thought of again. You answer what you can answer. You defer what you must defer. You receive what is offered with the simplicity of someone who understands that being listened to is often more important than being answered. The eldest reads alone now, the lamp on beside the bed, the book held with both hands. You knock and look in and say good night and receive the good night that is given by an eldest child who is half in the world of the book and half in the world of the room, and you close the door and let the reading be. This is also a kind of love, the allowing of the private interior life, the not requiring that every evening end in conversation or demonstrative affection. You let the eldest read. The lamp stays on for another hour, maybe more. You don't say anything about that. With the children in their beds, the house changes. The sounds change. The quiet that settles after children are asleep is its own kind of quiet, heavier somehow, with a quality of permission in it. You can move through the house now without the specific alertness of the hours when children are awake. You can let things that are not required right now simply be not required. You sit down. The sitting down after the full day is not entirely restful. The body is tired, but the mind still has its list. You think through what was done and what was not done, not in the anxious way of someone reviewing failures, but in the practical way of someone whose list is a working document. What must be moved to tomorrow? What must not be forgotten? The letter that should be written this week? the appointment that is Thursday, the children's shoes that need looking at. The radio is on. In the evenings, the radio carries different things than in the mornings, programs rather than news, though the news comes too, and you listen to it with the specific attention of a person who has someone in the news. The programs are comfort of a particular kind, the familiar voices, the familiar structures, the story you know will resolve within the half hour. There is something in the formulaic quality of radio programs that is genuinely restful. You do not have to hold anything in suspension, do not have to worry about how things will turn out. The world of the radio program resolves. Everything resolves. The mending is at hand, a sock from the basket, the darning mushroom, the needle and the wool thread. Your hands move in their habitual patterns and the sock takes shape under your fingers and the radio plays and the house holds its quiet. This hour is not nothing. It is the hour that belongs most completely to yourself. Not the early morning hour which holds the day's demands ahead of it, but the evening hour which holds the day's completion behind it. The work is done. The family is fed and clean and sleeping. For this hour you are only yourself sitting in a warm room with the radio on, mending in the lamplight. The tiredness at the end of a day like this is not the tiredness of deprivation or suffering. It is the weight of a full day, the specific physical and mental tiredness of sustained attention. Your hands ache sometimes in winter, in the knuckles, from the cold water and the work. Your back holds a low steady discomfort from the hours at the stove and the sink. Your shoulders carry the afternoon's tension in the place where tension always lives, that particular tightness that a good night's sleep will release and tomorrow will begin to rebuild. You make the house ready for the night in a particular sequence. The back door locked, the kitchen window latched against the weather if the evening has turned cold, the stove damped down to its overnight setting, where it will hold enough heat to avoid the deep cold without burning through the night's wood too quickly. The lights turned off room by room, the parlour first, then the dining room, then the kitchen last, because the kitchen light is the last you need, and you always feel a small resistance to turning it off, the way you feel a small resistance to ending any day before you're absolutely sure there is nothing further that needs doing. The stairs in the dark are navigated by memory and by hand on the banister. You check the children. This has its own sequence, the youngest first, the reassurance that covers are tucked, and breathing is steady, and the nightlight is on. The middle child, the check of the window to make sure it is closed enough that the draught will not reach the bed but open enough to let some air. The eldest, whose door is closed, whom you do not enter, only listen at the door for the even breathing that tells you that the reading has finally stopped and the sleep has finally come. Your room holds the end of the day. You sit on the edge of the bed in the near dark and you let the day go from you, not in one release but in the gradual way that days go, piece by piece, as the body quiets and the mind slows. The list becomes less urgent. The thinking becomes less sequential. The room is very quiet. Outside, the street has gone to its nighttime sounds. A dog somewhere, a car somewhere, farther away, the creaking of a tree branch in the wind. You lie down. The pillow is cool and familiar. The weight of the blankets has an exact rightness, the specific rightness of the things you have slept under long enough that their weight is simply the weight of rest. The house settles around you. The stove ticks. The clock on the landing ticks. These sounds are not intrusive. They are the texture of nighttime, as familiar as breathing. Tomorrow there will be more. There is always more. But tonight the house is quiet and the children are sleeping and the kitchen is clean and the stove is banked and the day is done. Tonight this is enough. This is everything. You close your eyes and the house holds you, and the night goes on doing its slow and faithful work of carrying you toward morning. The evening hour after the children are in bed and before sleep comes has a quality that belongs entirely to the after-dark version of the house, which is slightly different in its sounds and its temperatures from the daytime house. The house at night has settled. It has stopped its daytime expansion from the heat and begun its nighttime contraction as the air cools, and the sounds it makes in this contraction are the sounds you've heard every night for years without ever quite getting used to them, the slight creak and tick of wood and metal that is the house talking to itself in the cold. You know these sounds. You do not find them alarming. They are simply the house being what the house is. The reading, when there is reading, has its own character in the evening hour. The lamp beside the chair throws its circle of light, and inside that circle, The book is fully illuminated, and everything beyond the circle is in the soft shadow of the dim room, and the reading happens in this island of light in a way that feels pleasantly removed from the larger space, pleasantly contained. The book that has been lying face down for 2 weeks on the bedside table is sometimes brought downstairs for the evening hour, when there is no mending that requires attention, when the mind wants the particular rest of inhabiting someone else's world for a while. The writing of the letter, when the letter is due, happens in the evening hour at the dining room table. The lamp on the table, the notepaper and the pen, the small effort of gathering what the week has been and shaping it into the length of a letter, which is long enough to feel substantial and short enough to be read in one sitting. You write slowly, deliberately, giving each sentence the time it needs rather than the time you have, because the letter will travel far and will be read in conditions you cannot imagine and must be worthy of that reading. Sometimes in the evening hour you do nothing. This sounds simple and is not, because doing nothing requires a particular permission that must be internally granted, a setting aside of the internal list of things not yet done, a quieting of the voice that knows there is always more. The permission does not come easily. It must be earned each time by the honest acknowledgement that the most necessary things have been done, that the morning will accommodate what was not done today, that the rest is not a dereliction but a necessity. Once the permission is granted, the doing of nothing has the particular pleasure of a thing voluntarily chosen, rather than involuntarily arrived at. You sit. You let the house be quiet around you. You let the radio play its quiet late evening programs. You let the day complete itself. Sleep, when it comes on these evenings, comes the way it comes to people who have genuinely exhausted their day's energy, without ambiguity, without the restlessness of a body that has been insufficiently used. You put your book down, or your mending down, or you turn the radio off and you go up the stairs and you go through the motions of preparing for sleep with the careful economy of a body that is already partly there, and you lie down, and the darkness and the warmth receive you, and the house does its nighttime work of holding you safe and warm, and the sleep is deep and complete and healing in the way that only genuine physical and mental tiredness produces. The dreams, when you have them, are often domestic. Not dramatically domestic, not anxiety dreams about unmade beds or unfinished meals, but simply dreams that are set in houses, in kitchens, in the familiar geography of daily life, with the people of daily life moving through them in the slightly altered way that dreams alter the real. Sometimes they are pleasant. Sometimes they hold the anxiety of the waking life in the displaced form that dreams use, but often they are simply the mind continuing its work in the mode of sleep, processing the day's accumulation, filing what must be kept, releasing what can be released, making space for the morning's arrival. Consider the women who built these days, not the exceptional ones, not the women whose names appear in records, whose letters were saved, whose stories became the ones that got told, the ordinary ones, the ones who were simply and entirely present in the daily life of their households and their neighbourhoods, who did what needed to be done without anyone thinking it needed a name. They were not performing. That is the first thing to understand about them. The work they did was not for an audience and was not shaped by the expectation of acknowledgement. The bread was made because bread was needed. The children were held because the children needed holding. The sick neighbour was fed because the sick neighbour needed feeding. The action and the need were connected without the intermediate stage of credit, without the question of whether the doing would be noted or remembered. It was done because it must be done. This is not nothing. This is a great deal. The knowledge they held was not the knowledge taught in schools, and this was used against them. The absence of formal credential was evidence in the accounting of the world of an absence of expertise. But the knowledge was real, and it was complex, and it was accumulated over lifetimes and passed from hand to hand through observation and practice, in the kitchen and the garden and beside the sewing basket and at the back fence. It was a knowledge of materials, of what flour does in different humidities, of what soil needs in different seasons, of what a fever means in a small child and what it does not mean, of which stitches hold under stress and which are only decorative. It was a knowledge of people, of how to tell what a person needs when they cannot say it, of how to ease what cannot be fixed, of how to hold space for a grief without filling it. They were also tired. This needs to be said because the tiredness is part of the truth of it. Not a tragic tiredness, not a defeated tiredness, but the ordinary and cumulative tiredness of a person who works from before dawn until after dark in a succession of days without pause, The days off did not exist in the way they are understood now. Sunday was a day of rest in the ceremonial sense. The church service, the Sunday dinner, the quieter afternoon. But the cooking and the cleaning and the children did not pause for Sunday. The tiredness was incorporated. It was part of the daily weather of the life, managed the way all conditions are managed, by those who do not have the option of not managing. They found ways to rest within the work. This is the adaptation that is hardest to see from outside, and that was so thoroughly internalized that most of them could not have described it. The 10 minutes at the kitchen window while the pot came to a boil. The particular quality of attention that comes when hands are busy but the mind is free. The ironing, the shelling of peas, the mending, in which thought can happen without effort, in which the mind rests in its own movement the way a body rests in water. The conversation at the back fence, which was rest disguised as work, or perhaps work disguised as rest. The line between the two was not always clear. What they passed on came through the fingers more than through words. A daughter watched her mother bake bread, and the watching was the learning, not because there was no explanation, but because the explanation is always incomplete, always secondary to the embodied knowing. The way the dough felt when it was right, the way the heat of the oven registered on an outstretched arm, the way a fever in a child required a different kind of response than a fever in an adult. These things could not be fully described. They had to be witnessed and then repeated again, until the body knew them independently of the mind. The knowledge passed on was not only practical, it was philosophical, in the way that daily practice always carries a philosophy inside it. The philosophy of enough, the understanding that enough was not a failure of ambition, but a kind of wisdom, that a full pantry was richer than a perfect one, that a functioning household was a more worthy achievement than a spectacular one. The philosophy of attention, the understanding that the quality of care you brought to small things determined the quality of life in those small things, that the bread you made with attention was better bread, that the child you listened to with presence was a child who would learn to trust their own voice. The philosophy of repair, the understanding that nothing was too worn to be worth mending, that the act of mending was not defeat but continuity. These philosophies were not articulated as philosophies, they were lived. They came through in the specific gestures of the daily life, the careful folding of the wax paper to be reused, the turning of a heel on a sock that another woman might have discarded, the patience with a child that required drawing on reserves that were not visibly full. They came through in the way the neighbourhood functioned, in the borrowing and returning, in the meals left at the door and the extra chair set at the table. Think of what the 1940s required of ordinary women. The Depression had already asked a great deal. The management of households in conditions of genuine scarcity, the invention of meals from almost nothing, the maintenance of household stability when the economic ground shifted under everyone. And then the war asked more. The management of the same households now without the men who had been present, the carrying of worry alongside the carrying of everything else, the sustaining of children through years of uncertainty, the contribution to a collective effort that asked for labour and materials, and the particular spiritual labour of holding hope in conditions designed to test it. They did it. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the internal evidence of strain that would surface in different ways at different times for different women, but they did it. The households held. The children were fed and clothed and sent to school and grew up. The neighbourhoods sustained themselves. The networks of mutual aid continued to function. The bread kept being baked. The women who lived through those years carried something forward that did not have a name. Call it practical wisdom, if you need a name. Call it the knowledge of how to make a life from the ordinary materials at hand. Call it the accumulated competence of generations of women who had done the same work before them and had passed the doing of it forward through their hands. Whatever you call it, it was real, and it was consequential, and its absence, when it goes missing, when the knowledge is not passed on, when the connection between generations is broken, is felt as a loss even by people who could not tell you exactly what has been lost. The gardens went to lawns, the canning jars went to storage and then to yard sales, the ration books are in museum collections, the darning mushroom has retired, the bread for most families comes wrapped in plastic from a factory, rather than warm from the oven of the woman in the house. These are not tragedies. Many of the freedoms purchased by the changes of the following decades were worth what was traded. But something did go with them. some texture of daily life, some quality of material competence, some connection between effort and sustenance that was not entirely replaced by what followed. The women of those years did not think of what they were doing as history. They thought of what they were doing as Tuesday, or Wednesday, or whatever the particular day was, with its particular tasks and its particular demands and its particular small satisfactions. They were not historical actors. They were people living their lives, making their best decisions with what they had, doing the work that needed doing because it needed doing, and they were the ones there to do it. History, when it arrived for others. The men in the theatres of war, the leaders in the halls of power, the inventors and the commanders and the people whose photographs appear in the archive. But the thing that made all of those other stories possible, the stable homes, the fed children, the maintained neighbourhoods, the functioning social fabric, was held in place by the women who did not appear in the photographs and did not make the news. They were the ground on which everything else stood, the invisible ground. The invisibility was not neutral. It had costs that were paid by the women themselves and that were sometimes acknowledged and more often not. The work was not seen, and so it was not valued, and so it was not compensated, and so the women who did it had less power than the work they did warranted. This was the arrangement. Most of them understood the arrangement, even if they could not have named its structure, even if they would not have used the vocabulary that later generations would develop for it. And yet, the knowledge was real, the contribution was real, the love in the daily work was real, the particular love that takes the form of attention, of care, of the making of something with your hands for someone else's benefit, given without account and without expectation of the account being rendered. This was the real thing, and it persisted, and in the homes where it was practiced it left a mark, not in the record but in the people who grew up in those homes, in the ways they in turn learned to notice and to care and to make something of what they had. What they knew is still worth knowing. The cooking from almost nothing, the management of scarcity without defeat, the tending of the small and ordinary things that collectively constitute a life, the listening that receives what is offered without requiring it to be something else, the repair rather than the replacement, the patience that is not passivity but endurance, the attention that is not obsession but love. These women are gone now. They recede with every year, becoming history rather than memory, becoming something that can be studied rather than something that can be simply remembered. But the mornings they lived in were real. The kitchens were real. The bread was real, and the canned tomatoes were real, and the darned socks were real, and the letters were real, and the waiting was real, and the love was real. All of it was real, and some of it lives still, in the habits of hands, in the knowledge that passes from person to person when the conditions allow, in the ordinary and faithful act of feeding someone you love from what you have grown and preserved and made. The word for it in the era's official vocabulary is housewife, which is a compound of house and wife, two nouns pressed together, and the compound is meant to capture something about the relationship between a woman and a domestic space that the era takes as defining. The word is not wrong exactly, but it is not large enough. A housewife tends the house. But what these women actually did was not the tending of a structure, but the creation of a life, which is a different kind of work, larger and less definable and not reducible to any list of tasks however long. Consider what a household actually is. It is not the building is merely the container. The household is the relationships and the rhythms and the shared history, and the accumulated knowledge and the ongoing negotiation between the needs of multiple people living in close proximity. It is the knowledge of each person's particular vulnerabilities and strengths and preferences and fears. It is the memory of what was and the planning for what will be and the management of what is now. It is the emotional weather system of a family, its storms and its clearings, its particular warmth and its particular cold, maintained and tended and shaped by the person whose primary attention it receives. The women who did this work were not simply occupying a domestic role. They were practicing a social intelligence, a relational competence, that is among the most complex of human capacities. To know a child, fully in the way required by the daily management of that child's life, is to hold in mind an enormous amount of continuously updated information about a developing human being. To know a household, in the way required by its daily management, is to hold in mind the interdependencies of multiple people, multiple systems, multiple timescales simultaneously. The intellectual content of this work was invisible partly because it was uncodified, partly because it was performed in private rather than in institutional settings, and partly because the culture systematically failed to look for intelligence in the places where women performed it. There is a particular courage in the daily, not the courage that gets recognized, the dramatic courage, the courage of the single high-stakes moment, but the courage of the continuing, the willingness to rise to the same kitchen, the same tasks, the same demands, day after day, without the renewal that novelty provides and without the acknowledgement that public performance receives. The daily courage is structural. It holds the life in place not through any single act, but through the accumulated weight of 10,000 ordinary acts, each one chosen, each one done, each one adding to the foundation that everything else stands on. What they hoped for, these women, was not very different from what people always hope for. They hoped that the children would be all right, that the people they loved would come back, that the war would end and the depression would not return, and the ordinary difficulty of ordinary life would be the only difficulty required of them. They hoped for the continuation of what was good, the kitchen in morning, the children growing, the garden producing, the neighbourhood steady, and for the resolution of what was painful, which was various and particular to each household, and not available to generalization except in the broadest terms. Many of them got what they hoped for. The war ended. The men came back. The children grew up and left and built their own households. The neighbourhoods went on. The gardens were planted in the springs that followed. The knowledge accumulated through the years of making do and managing and attending was carried forward into peacetime, somewhat changed by peacetime's different demands, somewhat retained as the basis of a particular kind of competence that the following decades would find useful in ways they could not have predicted. Some of them did not get what they hoped for. The men did not come back. The children were not all right. The illness arrived, or the loss, or the kind of difficulty that does not resolve. These women carried their particular version of the same work, the kitchen, the children, the daily management of the household's life, under an additional weight that altered the texture of every ordinary task without changing the task itself. The bread was still made. The children were still fed. The weight was simply heavier. They managed it with the same practical competence and the same internal resource that the others managed their versions, because management was what was required, and management was what they had. Sunday morning has a different quality from the mornings that precede it, a different pace, a different smell. You're up at the same hour, the body does not distinguish between days of the week when it comes to waking, but the first thing you do is different. You do not go to the stove with the immediate efficiency of a weekday. You make the coffee, and you sit with it for a few minutes longer than usual, in the kitchen that has a particular stillness on Sunday mornings, a quietness that the street itself seems to hold, a collective agreement to move more slowly. The children dress for church. This is a more elaborate operation than the weekday dressing and requires more time and more negotiation. The good clothes come from the closet, aired the day before and hung ready. The shoes are polished on Saturday evening and left on the mat by the door. Hair is brushed with more thoroughness than it generally welcomes. The middle child resists the collar. The eldest endures the hair arrangement with a patience that is somewhat performative, but ultimately effective. The youngest is dressed last, when the risk of the good clothes being dirtied before you leave is lowest. The walk to church is among the week's small pleasures. It takes 12 minutes if you're not hurrying, and on Sunday mornings you're not hurrying, and so the 12 minutes stretch into something longer, into the particular extension of time that comes with unhurried walking on a familiar route. The same houses pass on either side, the Martinsons' garden, where the roses bloom in June with extravagance, the Pellegrino house, where the grandmother always seems to be sitting in the window, the corner where the maple has been losing its roof over the sidewalk since before the children were born. You know this route the way you know everything in the immediate neighbourhood, with the completeness that comes from daily proximity, the familiarity that turns a street into a place. The church itself has a smell that is its own thing, distinct from all other smells. Old wood and furniture polish and candle wax and something more difficult to name. Something that might simply be the accumulated smell of a great many people spending a great many hours in the same room over many decades. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is a smell of continuity, of a place that has held the same intentions over time. You sit in the pew that your family has occupied for years, not formally reserved, not inscribed, simply established through long habit, the way so many things in this neighbourhood are established. The service has its rhythms that you know well enough that you can follow them without full attention, which is not irreverence but simply familiarity. You know when to stand and when to sit and when to bow your head, know which hymns are sung in this congregation, and how the congregation sings them, tentatively on the first verse, with more confidence by the third. The minister's voice has a particular cadence that you have listened to through many seasons, many Sunday mornings in which the light came through the windows at different angles, and the children at your side were different sizes and the world outside was different. The prayers hold the things that daily life cannot easily hold, the fears that would overwhelm if spoken aloud in the kitchen over breakfast. The prayers receive them. The grief for what has been lost. The prayers receive it. The hope that is too fragile to be named in the ordinary exchanges of the day, the prayers hold it. There is a function to the formality of Sunday prayer that is different from private prayer, which is continuous and takes any form and requires no audience. Sunday prayer is collective. It connects your private carrying to the private carrying of everyone else in the room, and in the connection something is eased, the weight distributed across the congregation until it is manageable, or at least differently felt. The Women's Auxiliary meets in the church hall on the second Tuesday of each month, and in between those meetings the business of the auxiliary continues in informal ways. In the conversations after the service on Sunday morning, when people gather in the vestibule and on the steps and on the stretch of sidewalk in front before dispersing to their Sunday dinners. This is not idle conversation. It has purpose. The coordination of the visiting committee, the planning of the bake sale, the discussion of which families are in need of what kind of attention this month. It moves between the social and the practical, with the ease of a community that does not draw a firm line between the two. Mrs. Beaumont runs the visiting committee with an authority that requires no committee vote to establish and no formal title to maintain. She knows who in the congregation is sick, who is bereaved, who has received bad news of the kind that requires the presence of another person with a casserole and a willingness to sit quietly. She assigns visiting duties with the economy of someone who understands the difference between what needs to be done and what could be done. You are on the visiting list. You have been on it for years. The visiting is not a burden. It is one of the ways the web maintains itself. The Sunday dinner is the meal of the week. It is the meal that requires the most preparation and takes the most time and is eaten with the most ceremony. Ceremony in the sense of full attention, all family members present, the good dishes if the week has been the kind of week that justifies the good dishes, the grace said with more deliberateness than the quick grace before weekday suppers, the roast, if there is a roast, the potatoes roasted in the dripping rather than boiled, the green beans from the pantry dressed with the fat from the roasting pan, the bread from the morning's baking or the loaf kept back from Friday. After the Sunday dinner comes the clearing and the washing up, which are done without hurry, and then the afternoon. The Sunday afternoon is the week's rest, the most genuine rest available in the rhythm of a life where most of what resembles rest is actually the lighter end of the work spectrum. On Sunday afternoons you sit. You might mend. The mending basket is always present, but you might not. You might write the letter you've been composing in your head for several days. You might read, if there is something to read, the magazine that comes from the library, the chapter of the novel you've been moving through since January. The children are allowed outside on Sunday afternoons with instructions about the good clothes that are more hope than expectation, and they return at various stages of dishevelment depending on what games have been played and what weather prevailed. You receive them without excessive response to the condition of the good clothes, because the good clothes did their work for the morning, and anything that happens to them in the afternoon is the afternoon's business. The long Sunday afternoon light comes in through the west windows of the parlour, the specific golden light of late afternoon in every season, slightly different in colour but always golden, always that particular quality of late-day illumination that makes ordinary rooms look briefly beautiful. The armchair holds this light. The braided rug accepts it. The photographs on the mantel are illuminated in ways that change their expression, give them a warmth they do not have in the more neutral light of morning. You sit in this light, and you let the week accumulate in you. Let the days arrange themselves in memory into something coherent and complete. Sunday evenings are quieter than the evenings that precede them. The children are bathed and in bed at a reasonable hour because tomorrow is Monday, and Monday requires the early start. You sit with the radio, the Sunday evening programs are different, more musical, more settled, and you think about the week ahead with a kind of advanced competence, organising in your mind the sequence of tasks that will make it work. Monday's wash, Tuesday's baking, Wednesday's trip to the grocery, the children's appointments and the neighbour's birthday and the letter that must go out by Thursday. The planning is not anxious, it is practical. There is a difference, and you know the difference from the inside, from the feeling of each. Anxious planning circles and restarts and adds and amplifies. Practical planning is efficient and then it is finished, and the thing that was planned is set aside in the knowledge that when the time comes, the plan will be there. You have been planning practically for long enough that you can recognise the difference quickly now and correct the course when planning begins to slide from practical to anxious. Redirect it to the specific and the solvable, and let the rest be let. The week ahead holds what it holds. Some of it is known, some of it is not yet known, will only be known when it arrives, as things always arrive, in the particular form that the specific day and the specific people in it have determined, which is never precisely what was expected. You have made provision for the expected. You have built enough flexibility into the week that the unexpected can be absorbed without the whole structure collapsing. You have done what you can do, which is what you always do, which is enough. Let the Sunday evening settle around you, the fire low in the stove, the house warm, the children sleeping, the radio murmuring in the parlour. The week ahead is already in motion somewhere, already becoming itself through the decisions and the weather and the ordinary forces that shape ordinary days, but it has not arrived yet. Right now there is only this, the lamplight, the quiet house, the long day done. The church service comes again next week, the hymns you know, the pew you know, the prayers that receive what needs receiving. For now there is only the Sunday evening and the particular piece of a day that has done what it was meant to do. The house thinks in seasons. This is something you understand without having articulated it, because it is simply the nature of a house that is tended carefully through time. It responds to the seasons the way a body responds to temperature, adjusting, compensating, drawing in or opening out depending on what the year is doing outside its walls. And you are the person who makes those adjustments, who reads what is coming and prepares for it, who transitions the household from one season to the next with the practical competence of someone who has done it many times. Spring arrives first as a smell. Before the temperature changes in any decisive way, before the ice melts completely from the edges of the gutters, there is a smell in the air on certain mornings that is different from winter's smell. A smell of wetness and soil and something beginning, something turning over underground. You notice it when you step out to bring in the milk, or when you open the kitchen window on a morning when the sun is strong even if the air is cold. The smell is a message. The season is changing, certain things must begin. The spring cleaning is the first labour of the new season, and it is substantial. Winter accumulates in a house in ways that are gradual and therefore invisible until the spring assessment reveals them. The grime on windows that were kept closed, the dust in the corners of rooms that were used less, the heaviness in the rugs from boots and tracked mud, the smell of closed space that clings to the curtains and the upholstery. The spring cleaning addresses all of it, working from room to room with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understands that the work is one whole task, and not a series of unrelated tasks. The windows are the beginning. Washing windows in spring has an almost ceremonial quality. The bringing back of light, the removal of the winter's grey from the panes, the first clear look through clean glass at the yard that has been muffled all season, under snow and then mud. You wash them with vinegar water and old newspaper, the newspaper leaving no lint, the vinegar cutting the winter's film. The result is immediate and dramatic. The room changes when the windows are clean, the light comes in differently, the day is brighter. The rugs go outside, over the line or over the fence, and they are beaten with the carpet beater, a wicker paddle that sends the winter's dust up in pale clouds in the spring sunlight. The beating has a satisfying physicality to it, the satisfying evidence of the dust departing, the rug lightening as its burden lifts. The children have been known to assist with this particular task, drawn by the evident results, by the visible proof that effort produces change. You let them help. The rug does not mind an inexpert beating. The heavy curtains come down, they go to the washtub or to the professional cleaning if they are the velvet ones that cannot be washed at home, and the summer curtains go up in their place. The summer curtains are lighter in weight and lighter in colour, white or cream or a pale blue, and they move in the summer air in a way that the heavy winter curtains do not. The rooms look different with the summer curtains, more open, more alive to the weather, more willing to let the outside in. Summer has its own domestic rhythm, accelerated by the garden and the long days. The washing dries quickly on the line. The kitchen is warm whether or not the stove is lit. The windows stay open late into the evening, and the children stay out until the daylight is nearly gone, and the suppers are lighter. Cold things, or things quickly cooked, salads made from the garden's abundance, tomatoes still warm from the afternoon sun, sliced thick and eaten over the sink in a way that could not happen in any other season. The summer kitchen is a different room from the winter kitchen. It smells of tomatoes and fresh herbs and the sweetness of corn and stone fruits coming in from the garden, and later in the season it smells of vinegar and steam when the canning is in full production. The kitchen in August can be overpoweringly warm, the stove heated for canning, the outdoor air already warm, the windows providing ventilation but not relief. You learn to schedule the canning for the early morning, when the night's coolness has not yet dissipated, and to finish the heat-intensive work before noon. Even so, August afternoons in the kitchen are demanding in a physical way that requires a cup of cold water and a moment sitting on the back step before returning to the next jar. Autumn is the season of completion. The harvest is the year's conclusion, the accounting of what was planted and tended and what the weather and the soil and the luck of the year combined to produce. There are good years and lean years and years that fall between, and you have learned not to judge a lean year as a failure, which it is not, but as a year with different provisions, requiring adjustments in the winter cooking, slightly more reliance on what can be bought, and slightly less on what was put up. The adjustments are manageable. This is the experience of many seasons speaking. The autumn kitchen smells like abundance, even when abundance is not quite what the pantry holds. The apples from the tree in the corner of the yard stewed and put up. The last tomatoes from the vine, picked green before the frost and ripened on the windowsill where they take on a particular sweetness that the vine-ripened ones do not have. The dried beans sorted from their pods on the back porch in that last warmth of early October when the light is golden and the air carries the first edge of coming cold. The dried herbs crumbled into jars, the onions braided and hung. The first frost arrives sometime in October, usually at night, and you know it is coming by the quality of the evening. The air falling sharply, the smell of it like cold stone, the particular clear sky that foretells frost. You go out the evening before and bring in what is tender, the last of the basil, which goes black at the first frost, the remaining tomatoes on the vine, any peppers still on their stalks. You cover what cannot be brought in with newspaper or sacking. In the morning the garden is rimmed with white, the first evidence of the cold that will hold everything through the next months, and you feel, looking at it, both the small grief of the season's end and the satisfaction of having prepared. Winter asks for a different kind of endurance than summer does. Summer asks for physical endurance, the heat, the labour of the garden and the canning, the long days. Winter asks for something more internal, the endurance of constriction, of the shortened days and the cold that keeps you inside, of the particular cabin closeness of a small house in a cold month, when the children are underfoot and the stove must be tended, and the world outside is grey for weeks at a time. You manage it with the same practical ingenuity that you bring to the management of everything else. The winter kitchen is the warmest room, and in the cold months the household gravitates to it. The children do homework at the kitchen table rather than at the dining room table. You sew at the kitchen table. The cat, if there is a cat, sleeps beside the stove. The kitchen becomes in winter something more than a workplace. It becomes the hearth, the centre of the household's warmth, both literal and figurative, the room where life happens in the way that life in cold climates has always happened in winter, pulled inward toward the fire. The woodpile is the winter's security. You know its level the way you know the level of the pantry shelves, with an awareness that is not anxious but attentive, noting when it should be replenished before it runs low rather than after. The sound of the axe in the yard on a cold, clear day, splitting wood for the stove, carries through the house in a way that is reassuring, a sound of provision, of someone preparing for what is coming. Even the sound of wood splitting against cold air has warmth in it. There is beauty in winter that is different from the beauty of other seasons, and that requires a willingness to look for it rather than simply to find it. The frost on the kitchen window in the morning, elaborate and lacy, lit by the first light. The snow that falls overnight and transforms the yard into something simple and white and briefly unmarked. The particular quality of winter afternoons when the low sun comes through the bare branches of the elm and casts shadows on the snow that are thin and blue and strangely moving. You notice these things. You have always noticed them. Beauty that requires noticing is in some ways more sustaining than beauty that demands it. The seasons pass. This is the rhythm of the house and of the life lived in it, the larger rhythm that contains all the smaller rhythms, the daily rhythm of the meals and the work, the weekly rhythm of wash day and baking day and Sunday, the monthly rhythm of the cycle of supplies and the restocking, the seasonal rhythm of planting and harvesting and putting by and opening again in spring. All of these rhythms run simultaneously, nested inside each other, and you are inside all of them, living in the centre of this layered time. The house holds through all of it, through the cold and the heat, through the abundance and the scarcity, through the ordinary days and the days that mark themselves in memory as different from all the others. It holds because it is tended, because you tend it, because the attention you give it daily is returned in the stability that a well-tended house provides, the warmth that is present when you need warmth, the food that is there when you need food, the shelter that stands between the family and the weather and the difficulty of the world outside. The house holds, and you hold the house, and in the holding there is a deep and quiet satisfaction that does not require a witness and does not require a name. The body knows things the mind does not think about. This is what years of physical work have built, a body that holds its own knowledge, that can perform the steps of any familiar task without the mind needing to direct each one. You stand at the stove, and the hands do what they do. You move through the kitchen in the early morning, and the kitchen accepts you without resistance, the space familiar enough that it requires no navigation, only movement. The body and the house have made an arrangement, long-standing and very old, and the arrangement is that the body knows where everything is. The hands are the primary instrument. Household work in the 1940s is handwork in a way that will become progressively less true as the decade moves into the next, as the machines arrive one by one to take over what the hands had always done. But for now, in this house, in these years, the hands do the laundry and the bread and the canning and the mending and the gardening and the cleaning and the cooking and the care of children, and the hands know all of these things in the way that hands know things, through repetition, through the sensory accumulation of having done the same action so many times that the action has become autonomous. The canning hands know the weight of a quart jar, and how to seal it without burning fingers on the lid band while still seating it firmly enough to seal. The bread hands know the feel of dough at every stage of its development, from the shaggy mass of the first mixing to the smooth and elastic resistance of properly developed dough. The gardening hands know the difference between the root of a weed and the root of a seedling by the feel of them coming up in the fingers. The ironing hands know the temperature of the iron by hovering near it before it touches the fabric, a measurement so habitual it happens without thought. The body aches in certain places by certain hours of the day. This is not a complaint, it is a record. The lower back, after the hours at the sink and the stove, develops a specific ache that is its own signal, telling you that a different posture is needed, that the time has come to move to a task that does not require standing. The shoulders carry tension that accumulates through the day and is released only in sleep, or partially released in the evening sit-down, or partially addressed by the unconscious rolling of the neck that you do without knowing you're doing it, when you have been bent over the ironing board for too long. The hands in winter are roughened by the cold water and the work, the skin at the knuckles thickened and sometimes cracked in the dry cold of the kitchen in January. You apply the cream from the tin on the bathroom shelf, a habit so embedded in the bedtime ritual that it happens in the dark without looking. The cream has a faint rose smell and a slightly waxy texture, and it does something, though perhaps not everything, for the hand's winter condition. You have worn hands. This is not a vanity concern. It is simply the condition of your hands. The body's capacity for work is not unlimited, and knowing the limits is part of the competence. You know when you are running low, a specific tiredness that is different from ordinary end-of-day tiredness, a depletion that goes deeper, that signals the need for something more than an early bedtime. illness, when it comes, is managed with the same practical attention you bring to the household's other problems. The identification of what is wrong, the assessment of what will address it, the rest that is taken without excessive self-indulgence, but also without the martyrdom of pushing through when pushing through will only extend the recovery. You take to your bed when you must. You ask for what you need. Both of these are harder than they sound. The carrying is constant. Not the dramatic carrying of heavy loads, but the continuous low-level carrying of the household's physical requirements. The groceries from the store, the baskets of laundry from floor to floor, the baby from one arm to the hip to the other arm. The trays carried to the bedroom when someone is sick, the wood carried to the stove, the water carried for the boiler. A day's carrying is substantial if it were to be measured, which it is not. It simply happens, absorbed into the body's regular expenditure, part of the daily accounting that is never formally made. You have a strength that is unremarkable to you because it has built so gradually you could never locate the moment it arrived. The ability to lift and carry and work through the day without flagging is not something you achieved. It is simply what the days required and the body provided, and the provision became the new normal so smoothly that the before and after cannot be clearly distinguished. Women who have been doing this work for years have a particular physical competence that does not resemble the idealized fitness of the era's magazine covers, but that is more genuinely useful. A working strength, a lasting endurance, a body at home in its work. Sleep, when it comes, is generous. The body that has worked hard through the day sleeps as a body that has earned its rest, deeply, quickly, without the fitfulness that comes from days of insufficient physical occupation. You lie down and you are asleep before the thought of sleep has fully formed. This is not drama. It is simply the natural completion of a physical day, the body moving from expenditure to restoration, with the same efficiency it brings to everything else. By morning, the ache in the lower back has receded. The tension in the shoulders has partly released. The hands, oiled and rested, have a degree of suppleness they did not have the night before. The mornings return the body to its work with a readiness that is both physiological and practiced. The first hour of the day holds the stiffness of sleep, the limbs taking a few minutes to remember themselves, and then the movement of the morning work, the stove, the kettle, the moving through the kitchen rooms, works out what sleep has stiffened, and within half an hour the body is again at its full working capacity. This reliability is not taken for granted by you, because you have been sick and know what its absence means, but it is trusted in the way you trust the house's familiar pathways and the stove's familiar heat. There is a physical knowledge in cooking that has no adequate verbal description. The sound a pot of water makes when it's about to boil, a sound that is different from the sound it makes at a full rolling boil, and different again from the sound it makes when it is merely warm. The smell of bread that tells you, before the timer suggests it, that the crust is developing correctly. The specific resistance of a chicken joint that tells you whether the bird is fully cooked, assessed by the fork without thought, the information received and acted upon faster than language. These knowledges live in the body, not in the mind. They were not studied, they were accumulated. The body keeps time in ways the clock does not. By mid-morning the body knows that several hours of work have been done and that a cup of coffee would be welcome. By mid-afternoon the body knows the particular lag of the post-lunch hour when energy drops and the mind wants to drift. By early evening the body begins to wind toward its close, the energy settling toward quietude, the limbs willing to be still. These signals are reliable, more reliable in some ways than the clock, and you follow them with the same practical trust you give to all reliable information. There is a pleasure in the body's work that is not separate from the body, but is its own kind of satisfaction, felt in the muscles and the hands and the movement. The satisfaction of kneading bread, which is both the pleasure of a repetitive physical action and the satisfaction of producing something real. The satisfaction of peeling a bowl of potatoes with a practiced knife, the peel coming off in long continuous strips when the knife is good and the hand is confident, the pale flesh emerging, the satisfaction of hanging laundry, which combines the outdoor air and the physical work and the visual satisfaction of the clean things blowing in a row. The body also carries sorrow. There are days when the physical work is difficult not because the body is inadequate, but because the emotion in the body is too present. When the fear about the letters or the grief of something lost sits in the chest, like weight, and the hands must work regardless. You have learned to let the work carry the feeling, to let the bread kneading hold the anxiety, to let the sweeping hold the grief, to let the physical rhythm of the familiar work give the feeling somewhere to go. It is not a cure, but it is something. By evening, the body is itself completely tired and warm and familiar to you in the way your own name is familiar, in the way the kitchen is familiar, in the way the house is familiar. You have lived in this body for all the years of this life, and the body has lived in this work, and the two have shaped each other in ways you do not think about, precisely because the shaping has been so gradual and so complete. This is your body. This is your work. They have grown into each other like a tree that grows around a fence post, incorporating it, making it part of the structure. Rest is what the body asks for, and rest is what the end of the day provides. The bed is the body's restoration, the place where the accumulated physical labour of the day is processed and released, and the body is rebuilt for tomorrow. You do not take this restoration for granted. You know what it costs, what is spent in the earning of the night's rest, and the knowing makes the rest itself something to receive with appreciation, rather than merely to fall into. The body is not separate from the life. This sounds obvious, and perhaps it is, but it is worth staying with for a moment. The understanding that the physical work of the daily life is not the less important part of the life, is not the mechanical base beneath the real and significant part. The physical work is the life. The hands that make the bread and tend the garden and care for the children are doing something that is itself significant, something that requires skill and attention, and constitutes an ongoing act of care. The body in its work is the person in the world. They are the same thing. The radio was turned on first thing. This was a habit established so gradually that its beginning was impossible to locate. At some point the radio became part of the kitchen's morning, the way the percolator became part of the kitchen's morning, the way the particular sequence of tasks became part of the morning. You turned it on when you came downstairs, before the kettle, before the fire, almost with the same reflex as the light switch. The radio answered immediately with whatever it had been tuned to last. The news, a musical program, a voice reading something, and the kitchen was no longer entirely quiet, was instead inhabited by another presence, distant and reliable and available without request. In 1940s America, the radio was the household's connection to the world beyond the immediate neighbourhood. This is a fact that is easy to state and difficult to fully feel for those who have always had television or internet or the pocket-sized access to everything that later decades would normalise. The radio was the only voice of the world outside, and it came through a single speaker, and it required you to listen in real time, and it did not allow you to choose your moment. You listened when it was broadcasting. When it was not, you had silence. The morning news programmes carried the war. They carried it with the measured cadences of men trained to deliver difficult information with composure, and you listened while you worked, one part of you occupied with the bread or the dishes or the feeding of the youngest, one part of you attentive to the names and places that mattered to you specifically, that transformed from abstract geography into something personal. When the name of a region was mentioned where you believed him to be, you stopped what you were doing for a moment. Only a moment. Then you resumed. The music was the gift. In the afternoons, when the children were at school and the house was quiet enough to let the music come fully into the room, there were programs that played songs you knew and songs you did not know, and the variety programs where the big bands played the music that the decade was built on. You knew what you liked. You knew the songs that made you want to move across the kitchen in a way that was almost dancing, the songs that had that particular quality of rhythm that occupied the body without demanding it. You were not a dancer. You were someone who sometimes moved in the kitchen when no one was watching. There were specific songs in those years that held more than music. They held the time itself. They were made of the time, emerged from its particular conditions, and when you heard them later you would hear not just the song, but the whole weight of the year it belonged to. The songs that were popular while the war was on carried in them the longing and the distance, and the particular bittersweet quality of things made beautiful partly by their fragility. You learned the words without trying, the way you always learn the words to songs you hear often enough. They arrived whole one day, already known. The radio programs were the evening's company. After the children were in bed and the house was settled, the radio in the parlour or on the kitchen shelf held the voice of the hour. The comedy programs, where the laughter was in the studio audience and travelled through the speaker into your living room, creating a temporary sense of gathered company. The drama programs, where the sound effects, the creak of a door, the crack of a thunder, the insistent ticking of a clock, created worlds inside the listener's imagination rather than in any visible image. The music programs, where the orchestra played and the singer's voice was warm and close in the speaker, closer than any concert hall would have permitted. The ability of radio to create atmosphere through sound alone was something you understood from the inside of it. Sitting in a quiet room with the lamp on and the radio speaking, feeling the room change as the program's world was established. A drama set in the mountains was somehow the mountains. A program set in a city had the city in it. The imagination supplied the pictures that the eye had no access to, and the pictures were as real as pictures always are when they are made inside the mind rather than outside it. There was a particular quality of radio listening that is difficult to recover in retrospect, the sitting with it, not the half-attention of a later era, where screens are background rather than focus. The radio required the body to be somewhat still, and the mind to be somewhat present, because radio is entirely sound, and sound vanishes if you are not listening when it happens. You could do certain things while listening, the mending, the handwork that did not require counting or measuring, but the listening was primary, the mending was the secondary. This ratio has since reversed itself in the world, but in this room, in these evenings, it was still true. The children had their programs. There were children's programs in the after-school hours, adventure stories and comedies with characters familiar enough that the children greeted them by name, with the comfortable recognition given to characters who have appeared in the same time slot for long enough that they feel like acquaintances. You listened from the kitchen to the sounds of the children's programs, the slightly different register of the child-directed voice, the more cartoonish sound effects, the simpler plots resolved in 25 minutes. The children sat very still during these programs, in a way they did not sit still during anything else, and you thought more than once that there was something in this about the nature of attention, that it is never a lack of ability but always a question of what is interesting enough to command it. The news shifted as the war shifted. The years carried their particular accumulations of names and movements and events, and the radio carried them into the kitchen and the parlour and the bedroom, where the small clock radio allowed you to hear the morning news without leaving the warmth of the bed. You followed the arc of the war with the attention of someone who needed it to be over, who calculated each bit of news in terms of its proximity to the end. The end was not visible, but there were days when it seemed closer, and the radio was where you learned about those days. Music made grief, and music made joy, and music made the ordinary remarkable, in a way that you could not explain but that you relied upon. A song heard at the right moment could turn an unremarkable afternoon into something that felt briefly significant, could reach into the ordinary and make it beautiful in the way that light can make an ordinary room beautiful for 1 hour of the day, the light finding the things worth finding. Music was the light that the radio brought into the house, irregular and unpredictable, arriving in the middle of the dishes or the middle of the ironing and changing the quality of the work without changing the work itself. You hummed sometimes. You did not think of yourself as someone who sang, but you hummed, the half-heard continuation of a melody from the radio, carried into the parts of the day where the radio could not reach, into the pantry and the garden, and the moments of the evening too quiet for the radio. The humming was not a performance. It was the body holding a small piece of music, carrying it through the day the way you carry a useful phrase in the mind for when it will be needed. The neighbours' radios were audible through the walls on warm days when the windows were open. Different programs, different timing, sometimes the coincidence of the same program playing in 2 houses at the same hour, a kind of brief synchrony that made the neighbourhood feel smaller and more connected. The music that came through the wall from next door on summer evenings, faintly audible, not intrusive, was part of the texture of summer evenings in the neighbourhood, part of what summer sounded like. There were programs specifically for women in the household, programs that aired in the late morning and early afternoon when the men were at work and the children were at school, and the housewife was the program's specific intended audience. These programs were varied in quality and varied in their assumptions about what women wanted from a radio program. Some of them were condescending in a way you noticed without necessarily naming. Others were useful. Recipes, household tips, discussion of the management of the rationed household. A few were simply good programs, well written and well performed, that happened to be scheduled for the household hours because someone in programming understood where the audience was. Late at night, after the household was asleep and the programs were the late night ones, the talk and the quieter music, the programs that knew their audience was tired and did not demand too much. The radio was a companion of a particular kind, not a friend exactly, not a substitute for the person who was elsewhere and whose absence was the specific fact of these years, but a voice, a presence in the room, a reminder that the world continued to speak, continued to make its sounds, continued to hold its own rhythm, even in the small hours of the night when the kitchen was dark and the house was quiet, and you sat with the radio's voice low and the lamp low, and thought the thoughts that the day was too full to permit. There were certain stations that you preferred without being able to say precisely why. Something in the announcer's voice, perhaps, a particular steadiness in it, an unhurried quality that matched the unhurried quality of the late-night hour. Or something in the music chosen for the late slot, music with more space in it, more air between the notes, as if the programmers understood that the people still awake at this hour were not looking to be animated but only to be accompanied. The dial had its own geography, and you had learned the terrain of it the way you learned the terrain of the neighbourhood, by moving through it slowly, by returning to the same landmarks, by noticing what was there on one particular evening and finding it again on another. The radio in its late-night hours was not the same radio that the children listened to after school, or the same radio that carried the noon news. It was a different instrument altogether, tuned to a different frequency of attention, quieter, slower, less certain of itself, more willing to sit in the silence between one thing and the next. The phrase that the era will be remembered by is not a grand phrase. It does not appear on monuments or in the titles of books about the period, but it runs through everything, underneath everything, present in every kitchen and every shopping trip, and every repair made to something that might, in a different time, simply have been replaced. Making do. Two words that contain an entire philosophy of life, a way of being in the world that is not about limitation, but about the transformation of limitation into possibility. To make do is not the same as to go without. Going without is passive. Making do is active, requires imagination and skill, and the willingness to look at what is available and see in it the potential for what is needed. The woman in the 1940s kitchen who cannot buy butter, but has the saved drippings from the last 2 weeks of cooking, and the recipe for a pastry that works with fat rather than specifically with butter, is not going without butter. She is making do. The pastry is real, the dinner is served, the family is fed, the means are different, the result is accomplished. The Depression had been the first school. Those years taught an entire generation that sufficiency was not a baseline but an achievement, that the assumption of enough was exactly that, an assumption vulnerable to the kind of sudden revision that could leave a family without income inside a week. The women who had managed households through the 1930s arrived at the 1940s already accomplished in the arts of scarcity, already possessed of the particular ingenuity that comes from years of solving the problem of feeding people on what is actually available rather than what a recipe calls for. The substitutions are a science, or near enough. You know which things can stand in for which other things, in what proportions, with what adjustments to the method. Oatmeal in place of breadcrumbs to extend the meatloaf, applesauce in place of oil in certain cakes, which makes them slightly denser and slightly more tender and slightly more apple-flavoured, which is not a disadvantage. Dried milk reconstituted in water for baking, where the difference from fresh milk is negligible. The list of equivalences is long and continues to grow as the war adds to the list of restricted items and the practical intelligence of millions of women finds the workarounds. The government's food-stretching pamphlets are not wrong exactly. They contain real information about real substitutions and real methods, but they are written by people who have studied the problem rather than lived it, and the difference is sometimes audible in the prose, in the slightly clinical distance, in the relentless cheerfulness, in the occasional suggestion that reveals an unfamiliarity with how cooking actually works at the stove rather than in the laboratory. You use what is useful in the pamphlets and you discount what is not, which is the same thing you do with every source of information that has not been tested against actual practice. The sewing and mending side of making do is perhaps more visible than the cooking side, because clothing is visible in a way that food is not, and the making and remaking of clothing leaves a more literal record of the ingenuity involved. The dress that was made from the fabric of two dresses that were worn beyond repair, cut and recombined in a pattern that uses the good portions of each and discards the worn parts, is a visible object. It can be examined. Its seams tell a story. The careful matching of the patterns at the shoulder, the way the grain of the cloth runs correctly despite the piecing. These are evidence of a skill that required not only technical knowledge, but a kind of spatial imagination, the ability to see the finished thing in the pieces. The children's clothing particularly tells this story. A pair of trousers hemmed up to fit the younger child, the careful pressing of the new hem, the slight difference in the wear pattern of the fabric below the old hemline that reveals the garment's previous history. A coat with the cuffs let out as far as the fabric allows, the fold of the old turnback visible in a different weight of cloth. A dress taken in at the waist and let out at the hem as the child grows, the adjustments made not as visible repairs but as the natural evolution of a garment that is expected to last. Making children's clothes last required staying a step ahead of the growth, adjusting as the body changed, finding the hems and seams that had something left in them. The furniture in the house was managed with the same principle. Nothing was replaced before it needed to be, and replacement was deferred as long as the thing could be made serviceable. The dining room chair with the broken leg was repaired, not perfectly, not invisibly, but competently, with a good glue joint and a brace cut from a scrap of wood. The sofa cushion that was going thin was turned over, the wear on the other side being less advanced, and the slip cover was adjusted to maintain the neatness of the presentation. The clock that stopped was opened and cleaned and the spring tensioned, and it ran again for several more years. Soap was made when it could be made. A winter project requiring the saved ashes from the stove, the rendered fat from the kitchen, the patience to manage lice safely, and to wait the weeks of curing that the soap needed before it was usable. Homemade soap is not elegant. It is rough and yellowish, and smells of fat and wood smoke rather than of roses or lavender. But it cleans, completely and well, and a batch of it from a winter's work lasted through the months, and represented the transformation of waste, ash and fat, both of which would otherwise have been discarded, into something useful. This is making do at its most complete, the extraction of utility from what would otherwise be nothing. The garden is making do in the truest sense. The garden says, the family needs vegetables, the income does not straightforwardly provide them, the soil in the backyard is adequate, the labour is available, the knowledge is held. Therefore the garden, the logic is direct, the result is real, the satisfaction is multiple, the physical satisfaction of growing things, the practical satisfaction of providing food, the psychological satisfaction of the self-sufficiency that the garden represents, the sense of being less dependent on systems outside your control, more capable of providing for yourself from what is directly at hand. There is a pleasure in the problem-solving of making do that is its own reward, separate from the practical result. The moment of finding the solution, recognizing that the torn sheet can become two pillowcases, that the worn tablecloth can become napkins, that the broken colander can become the base of a seed starting flat, has a particular satisfaction that is almost aesthetic, the satisfaction of seeing the potential in the given and finding the method to release it. This is creativity, even if the word is rarely applied to the materials and contexts where this kind of creativity is most practiced. The neighbours are resources in the making-do economy. The woman next door has a pattern for the shirt you need to make, and you have a half yard of fabric that she needs for a different project, and there is an exchange. The woman on the corner has the canning kettle you need for the peaches this week, and you have used hers before and she will use yours for the tomatoes next month, and the kettle circulates through the neighbourhood as needed without anyone keeping strict account. The exchanges are not recorded because they do not need to be recorded. The relationship of mutual aid is maintained through use, and the use is its own record. The children absorbed the making-do philosophy through living inside it, not through any formal instruction. They saw the sheets become pillowcases, and the trousers become shorts, and the saving of tin cans and the flattening of aluminum foil for the collection drive. They saw the garden, and the canning and the darning and the repair of broken things that in other houses might have become discarded things. They took from this not a sense of deprivation, which would require a comparison with something different that they largely did not have, but a set of instincts about materials and possibility, an orientation toward things that asked not what they could replace, but what they could do. The acceptance of imperfection is part of it. Not the acceptance of shoddy work, you did not do shoddy work, but the acceptance of the visible mark of repair, the visible evidence of use and care and the continued service of things past their original prime. The mended tear in the tablecloth is visible at certain angles. The patch on the trousers is visible if you look for it. The repaired chair joint is visible if you turn the chair over. These things are not hidden, because hiding them would require a pretense about the nature of the life being lived, and the nature of the life being lived was that things were used and cared for and repaired and continued to serve, and this was neither shameful nor remarkable. It was simply the way. Making do has a social dimension that goes beyond the individual household. In the 1940s neighbourhood, the making do economy is collective as much as individual. The shared equipment, the exchanged patterns, the cups of sugar that travel back and forth between kitchens, the mutual watchfulness over the children that distributes the labour of care across the street's households, all of this is making do together, finding sufficiency in the resources of the collective when the resources of the individual are insufficient. The neighbourhood is itself a resource, assembled from the individual households making do with each other. At the end of a week in which you have made 3 meals where you thought you could make 2, repaired the thing you thought was beyond repair, and found the use for the thing you thought was waste, there is a specific satisfaction that does not require anyone to witness it. It is the satisfaction of competence deployed, of intelligence applied to the practical problems of daily life and finding, again and again, that the problems are solvable with what is at hand. The world has not given you everything it might have given, but you have made of what it has given everything that can be made, and the making is the thing. The making is its own justification. The phrase will not appear on monuments, but in the kitchens and the gardens and the sewing rooms of the 1940s, in the darned socks and the turned collars and the casseroles of last night's leftovers presented as something new. In the window garden growing the herbs that were too expensive to buy, and the apple butter made from the windfall apples that would otherwise have gone to rot, in all of it. The philosophy holds, practiced without proclamation, enacted without praise, making a world from what is available, finding sufficiency in the sufficient, turning the ordinary into the adequate and the adequate into the good. There are moments in the middle of ordinary tasks when time folds back on itself and shows you 2 things at once: the present task, immediate and specific, and the past task, which was the same task performed in a different year, by a different version of yourself or by someone who came before you. You are cutting carrots, and you are your mother cutting carrots, not metaphorically, but in the sense of the movement of the hands and the smell of the carrot and the tap of the knife on the board, which are the same movements and the same smell and the same sound. You're standing in your kitchen, and you are standing in hers. Memory lives in actions rather than in images. This is the particular quality of the domestic memory. It is summoned not by photographs or by deliberate recall, but by the repetition of action. The smell of the rendered fat, the particular temperature of the bread dough, the sound of the percolator. These things carry memory in them in a way that a photograph of the kitchen would not, because the memory they carry is the memory of the doing, the body's memory, which is older and deeper than any record. You carry your mother in your hands. This is not mysticism. It is simply the fact of how knowledge passes, through the hands, through watching and doing again, until the doing becomes yours in the full sense, until you cannot locate where her knowledge ends and yours begins, because they have become continuous, become part of the same practice. When you correct the children's bread-making posture, you're correcting it with a standard you learned from watching someone else correct you, with the posture that was right passed down through the gesture. The objects in the house hold time in the most literal way. They are the physical evidence of the years they have been present, their surfaces shaped by use, their materials altered by the passage of the household through them. The wooden rolling pin, silky smooth with years of handling, holds the shape of the hands that have pressed it, the oils of all the people who have worked with it absorbed into the wood over decades. The cast-iron skillet, seasoned over years to a blackness and smoothness that no new pan possesses, holds the history of every meal cooked in it, the accumulated patina of all those firings and coolings and washings and firings again. The photographs on the mantel are the official memory of the house, the record that the family has chosen to make visible and formal, your wedding photograph, in its studio formality. The children as infants, propped on the studio chair with the photographer's props, their expressions caught in that particular solemnity of the photographed infant, who is not yet old enough to perform for the camera. Your parents, from a photograph made when they were younger than you are now, wearing the clothes of that earlier decade, standing in front of something you have never been able to identify. But the unofficial memory, the memory not curated, not put in frames, not selected for display, is everywhere else. It is in the marks on the door frame where the children's heights have been penciled at intervals, each mark dated in your handwriting. It is in the drawer of the kitchen dresser where the accumulation of years has deposited objects of uncertain purpose, but definite significance. A button that came off something important, a key to something that no longer exists. A child's drawing done at 4 years old in the specific style of a 4-year-old, preserved for reasons that require no articulation. The kitchen has its own memory, denser than the other rooms because it is the room where the most action has accumulated. The wall above the stove holds a faint permanent shadow from years of cooking, the slight discoloration that no cleaning quite removes. The linoleum at the most used spot is worn smooth, the pattern nearly gone, the floor itself having recorded the pattern of the household's movement over years. The window latch was mended badly once, and the mend is still visible, a slightly different coloured metal where the new piece was fitted, as clear a record as any written account of the day the latch broke and the evening it was fixed. Children bring time into the house in a different way from adults. They carry the present absolutely. There is no past in a young child, no future, only the unmediated now, and in doing so they remind the adults around them of the completeness of any given moment, the fullness of the present that adult preoccupation with past and future tends to diminish. When the youngest is occupied with something small, a button, a bowl, the edge of the tablecloth, the occupation is total. There is no part of the child not engaged in the examination of the button. You watch this sometimes and you feel, briefly, what it would be like to be that completely in the present, that entirely here. As the years pass, the house accumulates the children's presence in it, and the children change inside the house, and what you witness is the particular layering of who they have been and who they are now, both visible simultaneously. The mark on the doorframe, the way the middle child sat in the kitchen chair at 5 and at 7, and the way the child sits now, the body longer, the presence more assured. The picture books on the shelf that the eldest has not opened in 2 years, but that remain because to put them away would be to complete a change that is still, in some part of you, in progress. There are things the house holds from before you were in it. The house was here before your family. Other people lived in these rooms, with their own arrangements of furniture and their own smells and their own particular morning rhythms. They are gone, but the house held them the way it holds you now, patiently, without preference, accepting the particular weight and heat of whoever inhabits it, adjusting to their rhythm, holding their sounds within its walls. The nail in the kitchen wall, put there by a previous hand from which you now hang the calendar, whose hand? When? For what purpose? The question answers itself with silence, which is the appropriate answer. The nail serves. The reason is lost. The neighbourhood holds its own accumulated time, streets that have been here longer than any present resident, longer than the oldest person who can tell you when things were built or changed. The elm tree on the corner that was a sapling before the present street was laid down, that watched the street arrive, that has been watching ever since. The patterns of settlement that created the neighbourhood's current character, who came first, who came after, how the community formed, visible now only in the names on the mailboxes and the styles of the houses and the habits of association that persist, long after their original reasons are forgotten. You think about the women who lived in this house before you. Not often. The thought is occasional, evoked by something specific, a strange mark on the plaster that must have meant something, a flower that comes up every spring in a corner of the garden where you did not plant it, a hook behind a door whose use is not immediately apparent. Someone put those things there. Someone stood in this kitchen in a previous decade and looked through this window at the yard. The thought is not haunting. It is companionable. You are part of a sequence that goes on without you in both directions. Memory makes the daily life richer than it appears to outside observation. The bowl in which you mix the bread holds in it every bread mixed in it before, and the knowing of this, the unconscious knowing that is simply the fact of long ownership, gives the bowl a weight beyond its ceramic weight. You are making today's bread. You're also continuing a practice, unbroken, that connects this Tuesday morning to the Tuesday mornings behind it, stretching back as far as the bowl can reach. The bread is made from the same flour in the same proportions, with the same hands on the same surface, into the same tins, in the same oven. The bread is the same. The bread is always new. There is a particular quality of time on the days when something unexpected happens to interrupt the household's routine. A visitor arrives, a child is homesick from school, weather traps everyone inside. These days have a different texture from the ordinary days, a different quality of memory. They are the days that surface in recollection years later, the departure from the established pattern, making them memorable in a way that the pattern itself, because it is always, is not. And yet it is the pattern that makes the departure notable, that makes the interruption significant. Without the ordinary days as context, the unusual ones would not stand out. You are making time here, not in the grand sense, you are not making history, but in the domestic sense, the sense that is perhaps more intimate and more real. You are making time into a place. You are making this house into a time as much as a structure, a specific accumulation of seasons and days and meals and letters and children growing and bread rising and beans being put up for winter. The house and the time are one thing. When you remember this house, years from now, you will not remember it empty. You will remember it full of the specific air of these specific years. You will remember the smell of it, and the sound of it, and the particular quality of the morning light in the kitchen, which is always slightly different from any morning light you have encountered anywhere else, because it is this morning light, the light of this house, in these years, and there is only one of it in the world. Wednesday is the day for the grocery. Not always Wednesday, sometimes the week's demands move the trip to Thursday, or the household situation makes it necessary on Monday. But usually Wednesday, in the middle of the week when the weekend supplies have been consumed and the rest of the week still stretches ahead needing provision. You know on Tuesday evening what is needed, having made the inventory in your mind during the afternoon, and you write the list that night in the small notebook that lives on the windowsill above the sink. The notebook with the pencil tucked inside its spiral binding, the pages slightly wavy from the steam of years of dishwashing nearby. The list is made in the order of the store. You know the store's layout the way you know your own kitchen, by habitual navigation, by long familiarity with the arrangement of the shelves and the departments. The produce is just inside the door to the left. The dry goods, flour, sugar, oats, dried beans and lentils, tea, coffee, run along the middle shelves on the right side. The dairy case is in the back, along the far wall, where the cold air from the icebox units can keep things at the correct temperature. The meat counter is to the left of the dairy, staffed by the same man who has staffed it since before you started shopping here, who knows your name and knows the cuts you prefer and knows the days when you will need the economy cuts rather than the good ones, and makes no comment on the choosing. The ration book comes with you. It is part of the preparation for the grocery trip the way the list is part of the preparation. You check it before you leave, noting what stamps remain and what that means for what can be purchased today. The ration book has become so integrated into the shopping routine that the trip without it seems impossible to imagine now, even though there was a time before the ration book and that time was not so very long ago. The adjustment to rationing was rapid, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, and necessity compresses the time required for adjustment. The walk to the grocery takes 8 minutes. The route passes the elementary school, where the children's days are underway behind the brick walls, the particular sounds of a school day occasionally audible through the open windows, a teacher's voice, a bell, the collective sound of many small people going from one place to another with varying degrees of purposefulness. You walk past without stopping, only registering the sounds as confirmation of what you already know. The children are where they are supposed to be, occupied, accounted for. The grocery in the morning is a different place from the grocery in the afternoon. The morning shoppers are the household women, here on their regular rounds, with their lists and their ration books and the particular focused efficiency of people who have allotted a specific amount of time to a specific set of tasks. There is a sociality to the morning grocery that is different from any other sociality in the week. The exchange of information in passing, the small conference at the produce section about the quality of this week's beans versus last week's, the recommendation passed along about which cut of the meat counter is worth what the stamps will cost today. Mrs. Palermo is at the grocery every Wednesday morning. She shops with a thoroughness that you admire and slightly envy. She examines everything before putting it in her basket, turning the cans to check for dents, pressing the bread with a professional assurance, evaluating the produce with a farmer's eye rather than a shopper's. She has a large family and manages it with the precision and authority of someone who has never confused love with laxity. You share a 10-minute conversation beside the canned goods every few weeks, in which more is communicated than the time would seem to allow, and you leave it feeling that the world has been adequately surveyed. The produce is the most important section. You move through it with attention, picking up and putting down, making assessments that are entirely sensory. The feel of a potato's skin for softness that indicates the beginning of rot, the smell of a tomato for the ripeness that the colour cannot fully communicate, the weight of a head of cabbage in the hand that tells you its density and thus its value. These assessments have no names. They are performed without a checklist. They are the accumulated knowledge of years of standing in produce sections and choosing, getting it right sometimes and wrong others, and learning from both. The dry goods are simpler, canisters and bags and boxes with their fixed contents, the quality not subject to the same variability as fresh produce. But here too there are considerations. The price per unit of different sizes, the question of what can be stored and for how long, the calculation of what the week requires and what might be slightly overpurchased for the sake of the slightly better price. The arithmetic runs continuously. You are always doing two things, choosing what to put in the basket and calculating whether the totality of what is in the basket is within the week's budget. Both operations happen simultaneously without either impeding the other. The budget is not a strict number written down somewhere. It is a known quantity, understood in the body the way a skilled craftsperson knows the tolerances of their materials, not from written specification, but from the accumulated experience of working within the same parameters day after day, until the parameters are simply part of how you see. You know when you're at the edge of the week's allowance, not because you have been keeping running tally in the store, but because a sense tells you, a sense built from long practice, that the basket is full enough. You are almost always approximately right. There are weeks when the calculation fails in one direction or the other, the week when an unexpected expense, the children's shoes needed before they were expected to be needed, the plumber who was necessary and whose bill was not, leaves the grocery budget contracted and the week's menus must be adjusted accordingly. You adjust, you pull more from the pantry, you plan differently. The adjustment is made without drama, which is not the same as it's being made without effort. There are also, less often but really, weeks when a small surplus allows something beyond the ordinary, a slightly better cut of meat, a tin of something that is not a necessity but that will make the week's cooking more interesting, the tin of tomatoes when you're between garden seasons, the jar of something sweet for the children's dessert, the small luxury of coffee slightly better than the everyday kind. These small excesses are taken without guilt, which is the correct way to take them. You have earned the margin by the management of the margins. The small luxury is the dividend. The meat counter deserves its own time. You stand at the glass case and you look at what is displayed and you consider the cuts visible through the glass, the marbled beef, the chicken parts, the pork shoulder, the sausages in their row, and you consider what you know about each of them, which is considerable. You know which cuts benefit from long, slow braising, and which are better quickly cooked, and which need the acid of vinegar or wine to tenderize them. You know the relative value of the tough cuts, which cost less and take more time, and you have long since decided that time is the more available resource, and chosen accordingly. Mr. Gruber behind the meat counter has a particular manner that is not warmth exactly, but is a kind of professional respect, the respect of someone who knows the customer knows what they are doing, and does not require the performance of expertise. He does not explain the cuts to you. He cuts what you ask for, in the portion you ask for, at the weight the stamps allow, and wraps it efficiently in the white paper and hands it across the case with the sticker noting the price and the weight. The exchange is economical. You appreciate the economy. On the walk home, the basket is heavier. The 8 minutes back have a different quality from the 8 minutes going. Going, you are ahead of the task still being formed. Returning, the task is accomplished, the week's provisions secured in the basket, the list checked off in the small notebook. The satisfaction is not dramatic. It is the modest satisfaction of something necessary done well, the quiet confirmation that the household will be fed, and the week has been planned, and the Tuesday night list has been turned into the Wednesday morning reality of full shelves and a full icebox. The unpacking of the groceries is part of the trip's completion. Things go where they go, which is to say they go where they have always gone, and where you would reach for them without thinking when you need them. The flour in the large crock, the sugar in its canister, the coffee in the tin with the red lid, the produce in the icebox in the order that protects the most fragile items from the least fragile, the things that must be used, first placed where they will be seen first, the bread on its particular shelf, the cans in the pantry turned so their labels face forward, the new additions going behind the existing stock so the older things are used first. The restocking of the pantry is an act of ordering that has a meditative quality when you bring it the right kind of attention. The shelves coming back to their properly stocked state, the gaps filled, the inventory complete, the week's raw materials assembled and waiting. You stand back for a moment after the last thing is put away, and you look at what the morning has accomplished, and the looking is itself a kind of rest. Some groceries are not purchased at the grocery. The eggs come from Mrs. Hartman 2 streets over, who keeps chickens in her backyard and sells eggs in the neighbourhood on Tuesdays and Fridays, bringing them in a basket covered with a cloth to keep them cool, knocking at the back doors. Her eggs are better than the grocery's eggs, fresher, with yolks the colour of the setting sun, the shells sometimes still warm. You buy them from her, and you pay her what she asks without negotiation, because the eggs are worth it and because Mrs. Hartman is a widow on a fixed income, and the egg money matters to her. The butcher who operates independently from the grocery is visited on alternate weeks, when the particular cuts he keeps, the things the grocery does not routinely carry, the beef shin for the long braised stew, the marrow bones, the chicken feet for the stock, are needed. He is an older man with red hands and a white apron that is always splashed with the evidence of his work, and he speaks with an accent from somewhere in Europe that does not match any specific country in your knowledge but that you have never asked about because the asking seemed like it might require a conversation you would not know how to finish. The small transactions of the neighbourhood shopping, the eggs from Mrs. Hartman, the occasional purchase from the vegetable wagon that comes through in summer, the surplus from a neighbour's garden offered over the fence, the exchange of items between households, are all part of the larger economy of provision that keeps the household supplied and maintains the social fabric of mutual dependence and mutual support. Money changes hands sometimes. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes the transaction is a jar of preserves for a bag of apples, or a favour this week against a future favour, or simply the recognition that 2 families have more than enough of one thing and less than enough of another, and that the obvious solution requires no accounting. When the week's grocery is secured and the pantry is stocked, and the plans are made and the meals are already forming themselves in your mind from the raw materials assembled, there is a moment in the kitchen, usually mid-morning on Wednesday, the trip done and the unpacking done, and the house quiet for a bit before the next task claims the time, when the week ahead feels manageable in a specific way. Not easy, not guaranteed, but planned, provisioned, prepared for. The week can now happen. The machinery has been wound. Whatever it brings, the kitchen is ready to receive it. In the windows of the houses on the street there are blue stars, small silk banners, a few inches wide, hung in the front windows of the houses where a family member is in service. The blue star declaring to the passing street that this house has sent someone to the war. You count the blue stars when you walk down the block. Most of the houses on your particular block have at least one. A few have 2. One house has 3, and the woman who lives there, Mrs. Eichenbaum, who came from a family of 7 boys, 4 of them now old enough to serve, moves through her days with a particular stillness that you recognize as the stillness of someone who's carrying too much to afford motion that is not entirely necessary. The service flag is a language, publicly spoken. It says, we are part of this. We have contributed in the only way that cannot be quantified on a rationing chart or a bond drive total. We have given a person. The person is out there, somewhere, in a theatre of the war that may or may not be named on the maps in the newspaper, doing something that we hope is survivable and that we cannot fully imagine even when we try. The gold stars are the other language. The gold star replaces the blue star when a family has received the news that their person will not come back, and the replacement, the gold star appearing in the window where the blue star was, or being added to the banner alongside the remaining blue stars, is one of the neighbourhood's most terrible small events. You know when the gold star appears before you have consciously registered the change, because you are watching the windows the way everyone on the street is watching the windows, not deliberately, not with the eye of someone expecting the worst, but with the involuntary attentiveness of a community that has agreed, without discussing it, to witness what is happening to its members. When a gold star appears, the response of the neighbourhood is immediate and wordless. Food appears at the door. Women stop by without calling first, because calling first would require the person inside to answer the telephone and compose herself sufficiently to respond, which is too much to require in those first days. The visits are short if the person is not ready for longer. They are longer if the person needs to speak. They are whatever is needed, which is determined not by policy, but by the sensitivity of the visitor to the quality of the need she finds on the other side of the door. You have made 3 condolence visits to 3 Gold Star houses on the block and in the adjacent streets. Each one has been different from the others because grief is particular, is specific to the person who holds it, and the relationship that has been lost and the circumstances of the loss and the individual character of the person navigating it. One woman was practical in her grief, wanted to know about the arrangements, about the pension, about the things that needed to be organised and addressed. One woman could not stop talking, needed to tell the story over and over, the story of how he was and what he said the last time, and what the letter contained, and how she had known before the letter that something had happened. One woman was silent and wanted only company, wanted another person in the room without any requirement for interaction. You brought food to all 3, not because food addresses grief, it does not, but because eating is the continuation of the body's insistence on its own survival, regardless of what the mind is experiencing, and because providing food is the clearest available physical expression of care, and because in a crisis the provision of a meal is something that can actually be done while most of what needs to be done cannot be done at all. You made the thing you knew best, the casserole, the bread, and you carried it to the door and you stayed as long as you were needed and you left without requiring any particular response to your presence. The neighbourhood's collective grief accumulates through the war years. It does not erase itself between losses. It layers, each new gold star adding to the weight of the ones before, each name read at the Sunday service adding to the list that is already long. The women who carry the most, the gold star mothers, the women whose sons have not come back, carry it publicly as well as privately, because in a neighbourhood where everyone knows everyone, the loss is visible, and the carrying of it is visible, and the visibility is itself a kind of witness. The war effort in the neighbourhood takes forms that range from the dramatic to the almost invisibly small. The bond drives are the dramatic form, the public rallies, the speakers at the town hall, the goal and the thermometer posted in the window of the grocery that rises toward the top as the neighbourhood meets and exceeds its quota. The neighbourhood meets its quotas. It always meets its quotas. This is not from patriotism only, though patriotism is real, but from the same collective impulse that drives the borrowing of cups of sugar and the delivery of meals to sick neighbours, the understanding that the whole is sustained by the contribution of the parts, that the parts are accountable to the whole, that the accounting is done not on any ledger but in the awareness of all involved. The small forms of the war effort are so integrated into the household's daily operations that they barely register as effort. The saved tin cans, flattened and taken to the collection point, the fats saved in the kitchen and submitted each week to the butcher's collection, the old silk stockings donated for the production of gunpowder bags, the rubber gloves, the old inner tubes, the ball of rubber bands saved from years of accumulated wrappings, all of it gathered and submitted because the gathering has been so integrated into habit that it requires no decision, only the continuation of the habit. There is a woman 3 blocks away who lost her husband in the Pacific in 1943, who has 2 children, who has subsequently gone to work at the factory on the edge of town that makes aircraft parts, who manages the factory hours and the household and the children with an efficiency that has made her briefly famous in the wider neighbourhood as an example of what a woman can do when she must. You do not know her well. You know her by reputation, and by the occasional encounter on the street or at the grocery, where you exchange the few words of women who respect each other, but do not have the intimacy of closer neighbours. You think about her sometimes, about the management required of her day, which is more complex than yours in ways that you can enumerate, but cannot fully imagine from inside. The children of the neighbourhood are absorbing the war through the medium of their daily experience in a way that is different from the adults' absorption. For the adults, the war is a departure from a prior normal. For the children of a certain age, the war is simply part of the world, as natural as the seasons, as constant as the blue stars in the windows and the rationing, and the collection drives and the radio voice reading the news in the evenings. These children will carry the war differently than the adults do, will remember it not as an interruption but as a condition, will be shaped by it in ways that will not be fully visible for another decade. The schools do their part. The children's schoolroom has a map with pins in it, updated by the teacher from the morning news. The children know the geography of the war because the war has made geography necessary, has made it important, has given the names of distant places a weight that geography class alone would not have given them. The children come home knowing things, the location of particular islands, the names of particular cities, that you did not know until the war made them known, and the sharing of this knowledge at the supper table is its own small kind of education. There are moments of grace in the wartime neighbourhood that are not about the war exactly, but that the war makes visible by putting everything in relief. The way the elm tree on the corner looks on a clear autumn morning, its leaves the exact gold of a thing in its last perfection before the cold. The way the children come home from school on Friday afternoons with that specific Friday afternoon energy that is different from any other day's energy, as if the approaching weekend has already lightened the body before the school day is technically complete. The way a meal shared in the neighbour's kitchen, with the afternoon light coming in, and the coffee hot and the conversation easy, can be sufficient, can be complete, can hold inside it everything that a moment needs to hold. The grace is in the ordinary. This is not a discovery that the wartime makes. The ordinary has always held its grace, has always been the primary location of the beautiful in the daily life, but the wartime makes it visible in a way that the ease of peacetime can obscure. When the contrast between what is and what might be is pressed close enough to the surface to be felt, the what is gains a weight it can sometimes lose in its familiarity. The kitchen in the morning, which is always the kitchen in the morning, becomes also the kitchen in the morning while the war continues and the men are away, and the gold stars are in the windows and the list at the church is growing. Both things are true simultaneously. The kitchen is precious. You carry all of this the way you carry everything, continuously, practically, without putting it down for long, because putting it down for long is not an option available to the person who is holding the household together, while the world outside makes its claims. But there are moments like this one, at the end of a long day, in the kitchen that is quiet now, with the stove low and the children asleep and the radio playing softly in the parlour, when the carrying becomes briefly visible to you as carrying, when you are conscious of the weight and of the fact that you are bearing it, and that the bearing of it is itself a form of strength. The strength is ordinary. It does not announce itself. It does not require anyone else to notice it. It is the strength of the morning and the evening and every hour in between, the strength that fills the percolator and tends the garden, and writes the letter, and receives the neighbour, and holds the children, and holds the worry, and holds the hope. It is the strength of the women on this street in these years, in kitchens like this one, in houses like this one, in lives that are not grand in any register the world keeps, but that are, in the register of what matters to the people inside them, absolutely and irreducibly full. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. The kitchen is quiet now. The stove has settled to its low evening warmth, the kind that fills the room without pressing against it, without demanding anything. The clock ticks on. Outside, the street is dark and still. Inside, the house breathes in the way houses breathe when everyone in them is asleep. There is a single light still on, above the sink. It casts its familiar pool across the linoleum, across the edge of the draining board, across the counter where the percolator sits, quiet and clean, ready for morning. The window above the sink holds the dark reflection of the kitchen, dim and wavering, the house looking at itself in the glass. The curtains are still. The braided rug is still. The bread box on the counter holds tomorrow's loaf wrapped in the cloth, still faintly warm from the afternoon's baking. The pantry door is closed. The floor is swept. The dishes are put away. The work of the day is complete. Somewhere upstairs the children sleep. Their breathing is even and deep and unhurried. The breathing of small bodies that spent everything they had on the day and are now resting in the full, profound way of those who have nothing left to worry about. Not tonight, not in this house, not in this night that is soft and warm and holding them. The light above the sink goes out. The kitchen returns to the dark, the gentle dark of a house where people are sleeping, where morning will come again, where the stove will be tended and the coffee will be made and the day will begin its slow, familiar unfolding. Rest here for a moment, in this kitchen, in this house, in this particular, ordinary, irreplaceable life. Let the night carry you. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to know, did your grandmother or great-grandmother ever tell you about daily life in the 1940s? What do you remember most from what she shared? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone.